In the 1880s, a journalist named Helen Campbell went undercover in Manhattan's tenements. She found women spending exactly 12 cents a day on food. Not because they were budgeting, because that's all they had. Here's what survival actually looked like for the working poor of New York. And hey, if stories like this help you drift off, maybe hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious who's out there in the dark with me. So settle in, pull those covers up a bit. You're warm right now, safe. Your stomach's probably not empty. That's worth remembering as we go back to a time when none of those things were guaranteed. The smell hits you before anything else. You're waking up in a tenement on the Lower East Side, maybe Orchard Street, maybe somewhere worse. The year is 1886, and the first thing your nose registers is boiling cabbage from the family downstairs. Then coal dust. Then something sharper underneath it all. Something you've stopped noticing because it never goes away. The privy in the courtyard. 20 families sharing it. Summer makes it unbearable, but even in winter that smell finds its way up. Your room is dark. Not dim. Dark. The bedroom where you sleep has no window, just walls on every side, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, and a ceiling so low you could touch it without stretching much. There's a bed you share with your sister, or maybe your mother, or maybe both. The sheets were white once, now they're the colour of old tea. Your eyes adjust slowly because there's nothing to adjust to. The only light comes from the front room, where a small window faces an air shaft. On good days, that window lets in a grey sort of glow. On bad days, it lets in the smell of the building across the shaft. Sometimes both. You sit up. Your back hurts. It always hurts now. 14 hours at the sewing machine yesterday, and another 14 waiting for you today. The treadle-powered kind, where your legs do all the work while your hands guide the fabric. By the end of a shift, your whole body feels like it belongs to someone else. Someone older. Someone who made a terrible mistake somewhere along the line. But here's the thing about being poor in 1880s New York. You don't get to feel sorry for yourself for long. There's no time. The clock is already running, and every minute you spend lying here is a minute you're not earning. So, you get up. The floorboards creak. They always creak. This building was thrown up fast and cheap 20 years ago, and it shows. The walls are thin enough to hear your neighbours arguing. The stairs sag in the middle from 1,000 feet wearing them down. Nothing in this place was built to last, including, if you're being honest, the people living in it. You make your way to the front room. This is where everything happens. Cooking, eating, working, living. Maybe 300 square feet for your whole family. There's a small coal stove against one wall, a table, a few chairs, a window that looks out onto the air shaft. Some families have it worse. The rooms facing the street cost more, so you're in the back, where the light never really reaches and the air never really moves. On the table, there's breakfast. And this is where we need to talk about money. You have, if you're lucky, about 12 cents to spend on food today. That's you, just you. If there are others, they have their 12 cents too, but right now, let's focus on yours. 12 cents to keep yourself alive for the next 24 hours. Now, 12 cents in 1886 isn't nothing. You can actually buy things with it. But here's the math that nobody explains to you when you're comfortable in the future, lying in your warm bed with your full stomach. A loaf of bread costs 5 cents. Good rye bread, the kind that fills you up and stays with you. The German bakers on the east side make it dense and dark, and the women down here know which bakeries give you the biggest loaves for your nickel. There's a reason a 5-year-old named Bridget knows every bakery within walking distance. Her whole job is finding the best value in bread. She's 5 years old, and she's already an expert in poverty economics. So that's 5 cents for bread. You have 7 cents left. Tea is essential, not a luxury, essential. The water from the street pumps is questionable at best. Those pumps sit a few feet from the outdoor privies, and the soil between them isn't exactly a sophisticated filtration system. People get sick. People die. But boiling water for tea kills whatever's lurking in it. and the caffeine gives you enough energy to make it through another 14-hour shift. Tea is medicine disguised as a hot drink. A month's worth of tea costs about 30 cents. Call it a penny a day, more or less. 2 teaspoonfuls to a cent, so you're down to 6 cents. Cheese, if you can get it, runs about 10 cents a pound. A pound lasts a few days if you're careful. Let's say 2 cents worth today. 4 cents left. Maybe some liverwurst. 15 cents a pound, so call it 3 cents for a small portion. Now you're down to a single cent. That cent might go to milk. A splash for your tea, maybe. Or it might go to the little bit of butter that makes the bread easier to swallow. Or it might go to nothing at all, saved for tomorrow when you might need it more. That's your day. Bread, tea, a bit of cheese, a bit of meat if you're lucky, maybe some milk. No vegetables to speak of, no fruit, nothing fresh, nothing that costs time or fuel to prepare. And about that fuel, coal in 1886 New York costs maybe $5 or $6 a ton if you're buying wholesale. But you're not buying wholesale. You're buying by the scuttle, a small metal bucket's worth at a time, because you don't have $5 lying around, and you certainly don't have anywhere to store a ton of coal, even if you did. So you pay 12 cents for a scuttle, which works out to maybe $12 a ton, twice the wholesale price. This is the poverty penalty. Being poor costs more. You can't buy in bulk because you don't have the money up front. You can't get better rates because you don't have leverage. You can't save money by spending money because you don't have money to spend. Everything costs more when you have less. The landlord knows it. The coal merchant knows it. The grocer knows it. Everyone knows it, except the comfortable people uptown who write newspaper editorials about how the poor just need to manage their finances better. So you can't afford to cook. That's the brutal logic of it. Dried beans cost almost nothing per pound. They're nutritious, filling, cheap. But they need to simmer for 3 hours. 3 hours of coal burning. 3 hours of fuel you can't afford. By the time you've cooked your cheap beans, they're not cheap anymore. The fuel cost more than the food. This is why everyone lives on bread and tea. Not because they don't know better. Not because they're ignorant about nutrition. Because bread doesn't need cooking. Tea only needs boiling water. Cold cuts don't need heat at all. The cheapest foods in the grocery are actually the most expensive foods for the poor, because the poor can't afford to prepare them. An old German woman in one of these tenements tried to explain this once. She'd been trained as a cook in her younger days, back in the old country. She knew how to make soup from bones and scraps. 7 cents worth of ingredients could feed her for 2 days. But she was the exception. She had the knowledge and, more importantly, she had the time. Most people didn't have either. I try sometimes to teach, she told a visitor. I give some of my soup and they eat it and say it is good. But they cannot stop to do so much. That is fuss. That word, fuss. It keeps coming up in the records from this time. Cooking is fuss. Nutrition is fuss. Health is fuss. When you're working 14 hours a day just to earn enough for rent and bread, everything else becomes fuss. Everything else becomes a luxury you can't afford, including thinking about whether you're slowly starving yourself. Campbell found one woman whose story cut through all the statistics. She'd come to New York from Ireland when she was young. Orphan. No family. No connections. No safety net. She found work as a seamstress, making shirts. Good work, at first. In 1880, she could earn $1.75 for a dozen shirts. That's almost 15 cents per shirt. Not great, but livable. You could keep body and soul together on that. By 1886, the rate had dropped to 85 cents per dozen. That's about 7 cents per shirt. Less than half what it was 6 years earlier. Same work, same hours, same skill, half the money. The sewing machine was supposed to liberate workers, make things easier, increase productivity. And it did, in a way. It also meant that more people could do the work, which meant more competition, which meant lower wages. The machine didn't free the workers, it made them cheaper. This woman worked 14 hours a day, sometimes 18 during the busy season. Her fingers bled, her back permanently curved from hunching over the machine. And at the end of it, she was earning maybe $1 a day on good days, less on bad days. Not enough to live on, not really. Just enough to not quite die. Here's what Helen Campbell, our journalist, found when she tracked down the women in the shirt trade. Most of them were earning less than $5 a week for 70 or 80 hours of labour. That's about 7 cents an hour. That's what their time was worth. 7 cents to an hour of your life. The landlord wanted his rent. The grocer wanted payment for last week's bread. The coal merchant wanted cash up front. And at the end of the day, there wasn't enough. There was never enough. The math didn't work. It couldn't work. The system wasn't designed to let people like her survive. It was designed to extract their labour as cheaply as possible, and then discard them when they wore out. She told Campbell what happened next. How the foreman at one factory promised her better wages if she'd meet him after hours. How she refused at first. How she kept refusing until she couldn't afford to refuse anymore. How she ended up doing things she swore she'd never do, just to make ends meet. Let God Almighty judge who's to blame most, she said. I tried honest work, I did. I tried it till I give out. That phrase, I tried it till I give out. It comes up again and again in Campbell's records. Women who tried, women who worked, women who did everything right and still ended up with nothing. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed to help them. You're still in the tenement. Morning light is filtering through the air shaft window now. Grey light, thin light, but light. Your sister is stirring in the back room. She's younger than you, not yet worn down by the machine. Give her a few years. The work will find her too. Everyone ends up at the machine eventually, or at something worse. You cut a slice of rye bread, dense and dark, like you wanted. The German bakeries know what they're doing. You chew slowly because that's what you've learned to do. Make it last. Make your stomach think there's more coming. The tea is weak, 2 days old, but it's hot. That's something. On the table, next to the bread, there's a little notebook. Your mother kept it, or someone did, before you. Every cent accounted for, every expense tracked. Not because anyone's checking, but because that's how you survive. You need to know where the money goes. You need to know exactly how close to the edge you are. Last month, $22.95 earned. $10 for rent. That leaves $12.95 for everything else. Food, coal, light, soap, clothes, everything. $12.95 for 30 days. About 43 cents a day for 2 people. 21 cents each. That's actually better than some. You're doing well, relatively speaking. You have each other. You split the rent. Alone, you'd be paying most of your wages just to keep a roof over your head. The women who live alone are the ones who really suffer. Widows, orphans, women whose husbands drank themselves to death or got killed on the docks, or simply disappeared one day and never came back. They're trying to survive on the same wages but paying the same rent as a family. The math doesn't work. It can't work. Something has to give. Usually, it's food. One woman Campbell interviewed was spending less than 50 cents a week on food. 70 cents in a good week. Bread, mostly. Rye bread because it's cheaper and denser. Tea because it fills you up and warms you inside. Maybe some cheese if there's a little extra. Maybe some milk on Sunday as a treat. But meat? Almost never. Vegetables? A luxury she couldn't afford. Her body was starting to show it. The pallor, the weakness, the way she moved like someone much older. She was 42. She looked 60. The work and the hunger had eaten away at her from the inside out. But what else could she do? Stop working? Starve faster? Beg on the streets? That's how women ended up in places they didn't want to be. That's how they ended up doing things they never planned to do. The choice wasn't between comfort and discomfort. It was between slow death and fast death. Between keeping your dignity and keeping yourself alive. Most of them chose slowly. Most of them kept working, kept eating their bread and tea, kept wearing themselves down one day at a time. Because at least that way, they could look at themselves in the mirror. At least that way, they could pretend they were still in control of something. The bread is gone now. The tea is cooling in your cup. Outside the window, you can hear the city waking up. Cartwheels on cobblestones, someone shouting in Italian, a child crying, somewhere far away. Time to work. You've got 14 hours ahead of you. 14 hours at the machine, feeding fabric through while your legs pump the treadle. By the end of it, you'll have earned maybe 85 cents, maybe $1 if the work is steady. Enough to do this all again tomorrow. That's the rhythm of life down here. Work, eat, sleep, work. Eat what you can afford, which isn't much. Sleep when you can manage, which isn't long. And work. Always work. Because the alternative is worse. But here's something that might surprise you. People in these tenements laughed. They told jokes. They fell in love and got married and had children, and celebrated holidays and looked forward to things. Not despite the poverty, alongside it. Because human beings are stubborn that way. You can't crush the life out of people entirely. It finds a way to persist, even in the darkest places. The women Campbell interviewed weren't all broken and miserable. Some of them were angry. Some of them were funny. Some of them were sharp as tacks, with opinions about everything and no patience for fools. Poverty didn't make them less human, it just made them human under nearly impossible circumstances. One woman asked if she'd ever considered eating beans instead of bread. Exploded. Beans? What time have I to think of beans? What money to buy the coal to cook them? What you'd want if you sat over a machine 14 hours a day would be tea like lie to put a backbone in you. Tea like lie. That's poetry, even if she didn't mean it that way. The kind of bitter, burning fuel that keeps you moving when everything else has failed. Not nourishment, survival. There's a difference. You finish your tea. You check your little notebook one more time, though you already know the numbers by heart. Then you head for the door, down the sagging stairs, past the smell that you've learned to ignore, and out into the grey morning light of 1886 Manhattan. The machine is waiting. The nearer the river, the nearer to hell. A carpenter said that once, walking down toward the Hudson with his toolbox. Big man, German maybe. His friend walking beside him, half his size, nodding along and throwing in curses of his own. They were talking about something else entirely, some grievance or another, but those first words stuck. They became a kind of motto for the West Side neighbourhoods, where the poorest of the poor ended up. See, Manhattan had its geography of misery all mapped out. The East Side had its tenements, sure. We just walk through one. But the West Side, especially down toward the river, that was different. That was where you went when you'd fallen as far as you could fall. The docks, the slaughterhouses, the gasworks pumping their smell into the air, streets that never quite dried out, buildings that listed slightly, like they were tired of standing. And the people who lived there? They weren't born to it, most of them. That's the part that catches in your throat. They came from somewhere else, somewhere better. They had different lives once, different expectations. And then, something happened. A husband died, a job disappeared, an illness ate through their savings like acid through cloth, and they woke up one morning in a West Side tenement, wondering how the hell they got there. Let me tell you about one of them. She was a widow, about 50 years old when her story was recorded. No name in the records, just her circumstances. She'd been living in Greenwich Village, that little triangle of old New York where the streets don't make sense and the buildings have character. Respectable neighbourhood, respectable life, the kind of life where you could have the relations over without being ashamed. That mattered to her. You have to understand how much that mattered. Respectability wasn't vanity, it was survival of a different kind. If people talked about you, if your circumstances became known, doors closed, opportunities vanished. The line between poor but decent and fallen was thinner than a sewing needle, and once you crossed it, you didn't come back. So when her husband died, she did what widows in her position did. She held on. She stayed in Greenwich Village as long as she could, spending down her savings to maintain appearances. Because surely something would change. Surely an opportunity would present itself. Surely this was temporary. It wasn't. The money ran out, all of it, and she found herself, at 50 years old, with no clue that any friend could trace. Moving into a west side tenement far toward the North River. Irish neighbourhood. First floor of a big building full of strangers. 2 rooms, one of them a closet where a bed could barely fit, and whatever furniture she'd managed to keep from the old life, the life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. Might have been better to go to the country, she told the woman who interviewed her later. But you see, I wasn't used to the country, and then any work I could get was right here. The work was sewing. Children's suits mostly. Skirts. The kind of detailed handwork that required skill and paid almost nothing. She could sew. So could her daughter, Emmeline. Emmy, she called her. And together, at first, they made it work. We made $15 a week sometimes, she said. We could have got ahead. $15 a week. That's actually pretty good for piecework in 1886. $2 a day or thereabouts. Enough to build something on. Enough to maybe, eventually, climb back out of the hole they'd fallen into. But there was a debt. Her husband's debt. Not much by some standards, but it existed, and she couldn't let it stand against his name. They'd never owed anybody a penny, the two of them. That had been their pride. So she paid it off. Every cent. Cleared his name before she could think about saving anything for herself. And then she got sick. Rheumatic fever. The kind that settles into your joints and never quite leaves. She recovered, mostly. But her strength didn't come back. Not all of it. Not enough. And while she was recovering, the prices kept falling. The rates for piecework kept dropping. The same work that had paid $15 a week started paying less and less. By the time she was talking to that interviewer, Emmy was the one doing most of the earning. 12 hours a day at the machine, 14 more often. And the most she'd made for more than a year and a half was 85 cents a day. 85 cents. For 14 hours of work. That's about 6 cents an hour. That's what Emmy's time was worth. And on that, the two of them managed. I suppose we couldn't if I ever went out, the mother said, but I've had no shoes in 2 years. Let that land for a second. 2 years without shoes. Not because she didn't want them, because she couldn't afford them. Every time there might have been enough money for shoes, something else needed it more. Food, rent, coal, Emmy's shoes. Because Emmy had to go out, had to walk to work, had to be seen. The mother could stay inside. The mother could patch her old shoes with scraps from her dead husband's coat and keep along. But we never get ahead enough for me to have shoes and Emmy too. And she's the one that has to go out. Here's where the notebook comes in. This woman kept records, detailed records. Every cent that came in, every cent that went out. She'd done it even when she had plenty, she said. It was second nature. And now, living on the edge, that notebook was the only thing standing between her and total chaos. Take last month, she said. It had 27 working days. $22.95 earned. She knew the exact number, not rounded. $22.95. Out of that, $10 for rent. First thing. Always first, because without the roof, nothing else matters. She'd been in that building 11 years by then. They'd raised the rent on her twice in that time, $1 each time. Still, $10 a month for 2 rooms, first floor. Not the worst she could do. That left $12.95. For everything else. Food, coal, light, oil for the stove, soap for washing, paper, because they did want to see a paper sometimes, clothes, when clothes absolutely couldn't wait any longer. Everything that kept two human beings alive for a month had to come out of $12.95. She showed the interviewer her weekly expense book, 1 week's food spending, laid out in her careful handwriting. It was an expensive week, she said, almost apologetically. She'd bought a whole pound of butter at once, but it would last into the next week. So really, it balanced out. There's no meat, she said. We like it, but we only get a bit for Sundays, sometimes. And then, this detail, this small human detail that says more than any statistic. Emmy never wants much. Running a machine all day seems to take your appetite, but she likes clams. Clams. Because clams were cheap in New York, plentiful. You could get them fresh from the vendors near the docks. And twice that week, according to the notebook, they'd had clams. A small thing, a tiny luxury. But the mother remembered it, wrote it down, because Emmy liked clams. Now here's something the mother figured out on her own, and it saved them more than once. I happened to read in the paper a good while ago, she said, that you could make soup of the water the cabbage was boiled in, a quart of the water and a cup of milk and a bit of butter and some flour to thicken it. You wouldn't think it could be good, but it is, and it goes a good way. Cabbage water soup. The kind of recipe that only exists when you're too poor to throw anything away. The water you'd normally dump down the drain turned into something you can eat. It sounds desperate because it was desperate, but she wasn't ashamed of it. She was proud. She'd found a way to stretch nothing into something. How could 12 cents worth of coal do a week's cooking? She asked, answering a question nobody had posed. It couldn't. It didn't. So she'd found another way. A little oil stove, the kind that just boiled a kettle. Tea and bread and butter mostly. That's what they had. But a gallon of oil went a long way, and she could cook small things over it too. The washing still took coal, and she had to have soap and all that. But for daily cooking, the oil stove was the answer. I don't see how we could spend less, she said. I've learnt to manage even with what we get now. And then, because even in poverty people find ways to help each other, she mentioned her neighbour. A German woman lived on the 4th floor, fell on the ice last winter and sprained her ankle. The widow and Emmy had looked after her until she could walk again, and now the German woman wouldn't mind talking about how she managed, if the interviewer wanted to go up. But before we climb those stairs, there's something else you need to know. Something that makes this whole story burn a little brighter, or darker, depending on how you look at it. While this widow was patching her shoes with scraps of her dead husband's coat, while Emmy was working 14 hours for 85 cents, while they were eating cabbage water soup and counting every penny in a notebook, the professional economists of the day were explaining why there was no poverty problem in America. They had numbers. They loved their numbers. In 1860, they said, the property of this country, equally divided, would have given every man, woman and child $514 each. In 1870, that share would have been $624. In 1880, $814. And in 1886, the year our widow was counting her pennies, the economists estimated that an equal division would give everyone over $900. What madness, they said, to talk of suffering when this flood of wealth pours through the land. You see the trick, right? The per capita calculation. Divide the total wealth of the country by the total population and pretend that means something. As if a factory owner's millions and a seamstress's pennies averaged out to everyone being comfortable. As if wealth was actually distributed, instead of pooled at the top. The majority are perfectly comfortable, the economists wrote. Admitting that the lowest class suffer, it is chiefly crime, drunkenness and such that brings the suffering. Crime, drunkenness. Their own moral failings. That's why people were poor. Not the 7 cents an hour, not the rent that ate half their wages, not the coal that cost twice as much because they couldn't buy in bulk. No, they were poor because they deserved to be poor, because they'd made bad choices, because they weren't trying hard enough. The widow in her tenement, patching her shoes and counting her cabbage water, had never been drunk in her life, had never committed a crime, had worked and saved and done everything right. And here she was anyway. Let us see how comfortable, Helen Campbell wrote, after hearing story after story like this one. Let us see. Meanwhile, uptown, people read the Economist's reports and nodded and felt reassured. The poor were taken care of. The system worked. Anyone who said otherwise was exaggerating, or lying, or trying to stir up trouble. It's easier to believe that than to look at the numbers in a widow's notebook. Easier to believe in per capita wealth than in 2 years without shoes. Easier to believe the majority are comfortable than to climb 4 flights of stairs to a 10-foot room where a German woman tries to explain how she survives on 45 cents a day. But we're going to climb those stairs in a minute. First, one more detail about the widow. One more small thing that says everything about how people lived. This week was an expensive one, she'd said about her food budget, because she bought butter all at once, and they had to have the scissors sharpened. The scissors sharpened. 5 cents. When you're living on $12.95 a month for everything, 5 cents for scissors sharpening goes in the notebook. 5 cents matters. And she felt the need to explain it, to justify it, because it made the week look expensive. Even though sharp scissors meant faster work, which meant more pieces finished, which meant more money earned. The 5 cents would pay for itself, she knew that, but still, it felt like an extravagance. There would have been 5 cents for wood too, she added, but they're building down the street, and one of the boys upstairs brought me a basket full of bits, scraps of wood from a construction site, free fuel, a small gift from a neighbour boy who'd thought of her. That's how you survived, not just by counting pennies, but by being part of a community that looked out for each other. The boy didn't have to bring her that wood, he just did, because that's what you did. The widow's rooms were on the 1st floor, the German woman's were on the 4th, and between them, in the hallways and on the stairs, a whole building full of people doing the same thing, counting the same pennies, making the same calculations, trying to figure out how to make nothing stretch into something. The stairs were a grade below the first building in cleanliness. Children everywhere, swarming in the halls, on the steps, the smell of a defective sink on one of the landings, the kind of smell that got into everything and never quite washed out. But up on the 4th floor, in that 10-foot square room with its one window, there was something different. Spotless. Every inch of that tiny space was clean, scrubbed and ordered and maintained with the kind of fierce pride that poverty couldn't touch. The German woman kept it that way. 65 years old, working for day wages when her body would let her, earning maybe $2.70 a week, and still, her room was immaculate. "Why not?" she said, when the interviewer commented on it, as if the question itself was strange, as if there was any other way to live. She was ready to talk, ready to explain her whole economy, how every cent worked, how every decision got made. And she had more to say than just her own story, because she bought food every day for the sick girl downstairs, the one who couldn't go out anymore, and that was another story entirely. But we'll get to her. Right now, you're climbing those stairs, 4 flights, past the smell of the broken sink, past the children who've learned to flatten themselves against the wall when adults come through. Your bed is waiting for you, warm and soft, in a future that hasn't happened yet. But for now, you're here, in 1886, on the west side, nearer to the river, nearer to hell. The 4th floor. You've climbed past the broken sink on the 2nd landing, past the children who scatter when they see a stranger, past doors that stay closed, hiding whatever's behind them. And now? You're standing in front of a room that's maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. One window, one woman, 65 years old, And it's clean. Not just tidy, clean. The kind of clean that takes effort when there's no running water in the building, when every drop has to be hauled up 4 flights of stairs. The floor is scrubbed. The window actually lets in light. There's a small stove in the corner, and a saucepan on it, and something that smells like it might actually be food. Why not? The old woman says when you notice. That's her whole explanation. Why not? As if there's no other way to live. As if poverty is one thing and filth is another, and she refuses to let them be the same thing. Her name doesn't appear in the records, just her age, her circumstances, her words in that thick German accent that the interviewer tried to capture on paper. "I tells you mine," she said, "and more too. So let's listen." She earns 45 cents a day, sometimes 50, when she can work, which isn't every day anymore. Her body doesn't cooperate like it used to. 65 years is a lot of years, especially when most of them have been spent in labour of one kind or another. "If I were quick as a girl," she said, "I could save much. But I have 65 year. How shall I be quick?" So her week brings in maybe $2.70, sometimes a little more, sometimes less. Call it $10 a month on average, 12 on a good month. Out of that, $3 goes to rent. For this 10-foot room on the 4th floor of a building that smells like a broken sink. $3, and she has it better than some. That leaves $7 for everything else. Now, watch how she does it. Bread first. Rye bread, because that is stronger as your fine wheat. Not white bread, the kind that puffs up pretty and leaves you hungry an hour later. Rye, dense, dark. The bread that German immigrants knew from the old country. The bread that fills your stomach and stays there. 5 cents a loaf. A loaf lasts a day and some of the next if she's careful. Tea. Always tea. 30 cents buys a month's worth, which works out to a penny a day. She used to drink beer back in Germany. Everyone did. But American beer is different. She'd watched women drink it and descend, get tipsy, lose themselves. So she switched to tea. Tea is American, she said, meaning tea is what you drink here if you want to stay respectable. Cheese when she has it, 10 cents a pound. A pound lasts a week if she's not greedy. Liverwurst sometimes, 15 cents a pound, the best value for meat, or something close to meat. 1 pound can stretch 7 days if you slice it thin enough. Sugar, a pound, sometimes 2, for the tea. Butter? No, never butter. Milk? Once a week, a cent's worth on Sunday, as a treat. That's her diet. Bread, tea, cheese, liverwurst when she can manage it, sugar in the tea, milk on Sunday. Add it up, and it comes to maybe 50 cents a week for food, 60 on a high week. But here's the thing she mentioned next, and it's the part that sticks with you. "I eat not ever all I could," she said, "for I must be warm a little." She's choosing between food and heat every day. The coal costs money, and the cold is real, and her old body feels it in ways it didn't used to. So she eats less than she could, less than her body wants, because she has to save something for the stove, for the warmth that keeps her alive through the winter nights. And then there are shoes. "It is bad to be big as I," she said, "for shoes not last." She's a large woman, her feet are large. The shoes wear out faster, and replacing them takes money she doesn't have. So she patches, she makes do. She walks carefully to preserve what little soul is left. But here's where it gets strange. Or maybe not strange, maybe human. "I thank the good God," she said, "only that there is no more Hans or Lisa or any to be hungry with me. It is good they go." Her family is dead. Her husband, her daughter Lisa, others maybe. The records don't say. But they're gone, all of them, and she's grateful. Not because she didn't love them, because she did, because watching them starve would have been worse than starving alone. Because feeding herself is hard enough without having to look into the eyes of someone who depends on you and tell them there's nothing more to give. It is good they go. That's poverty talking. The kind of poverty where death becomes a mercy, where you thank God for emptying your table because at least now you only have to fail yourself. She lives alone in that 10-foot room, scrubs it clean, counts her pennies, eats less than she could, and thanks God that there's no one left to share her hunger. But she's not entirely alone. There's a girl downstairs, young woman really, sick, can't go out anymore. Someone the German woman has taken under her wing, in whatever way a 65-year-old living on $7 a month can take anyone under anything. You buy for someone else, the interviewer said, prompting her. Oh yes, the German woman replied, but she will die soon, and care not. That bluntness, that German directness. The girl is dying, and the German woman knows it, and there's no point pretending otherwise. Death is coming. The only question is what happens between now and then. It is the kind of that care, she continued. The children, 16 and 18, and cannot earn. So there's a household downstairs, a dying mother, an old grandfather, children old enough to work but not working, for reasons the records don't explain. Maybe there's no work to be had. Maybe they're needed at home. Maybe they're sick too. Whatever the reason, they're not earning, and the mother can barely keep them alive. She sews all day on the machine, the German woman explained. It is babies' cloaks. So bright and nice. Baby cloaks. The fancy kind that wealthy mothers buy for their infants. 2 linings, a cape, cuffs with scalloped edges. Everything stitched and bound and hemmed. The work is precise. It has to be. Rich people notice the details. In 2 days she will make 3. For see, there is 2 linings and cape and cuff is all scallop, and she must stitch first and then bind and hem. All is hem all over inside. So nice, and she makes them so nice. The German woman was almost admiring the quality of the work, the skill required. This sick girl, dying by inches, was producing beautiful things. Things that would keep some wealthy baby warm. Things that would be praised and admired in parlours uptown. But $8 a dozen is all. $8 for 12 cloaks. That's 66 cents each for something that required 2 days to make 3 of them. Do the math. 2 days equals about 16 working hours, minimum. 3 cloaks equals about $2. That's 12.5 cents an hour for work that demanded real skill, real precision, real craftsmanship. And she couldn't even maintain that pace. It is a week for 9, the German woman said, and so she set not more as $5, because she is sick and must stop. 9 cloaks a week, $6 worth of work at the going rate, but the girl was too sick to finish them all. She'd earn maybe $5 instead, and out of that $5, she had to pay rent. $5.50 a month, more than a week's wages just for the room. The math doesn't work. It can't work. And there is the grandfather that is old, the German woman continued, and a kinder, and she all must live. An old man who can't work, a child who can't work, a dying mother who's the only one bringing in money. $5 a week on a good week, $5.50 for rent. Even before food, before coal, before anything else, they're already in the hole. So, the German woman helps. I pay for her this week $1.60 for bread and tea and potatoes, and some milk and molasses for the kinder on bread and butter a little, but not meat. $1.60. That's nearly a quarter of the German woman's weekly income, given to the family downstairs. For bread, for tea, for potatoes, for the small things that keep people alive. Molasses for the children to spread on their bread, because butter is too expensive, and you need something to make plain bread go down. But not meat. Even with the German woman's help, there's no meat. The grandfather eat too much, the German woman added. But how shall one help it? An old man with an appetite. Maybe his mind is going. Maybe he doesn't understand how little there is. Maybe he's just hungry, the way old bodies get hungry, and no one has the heart to tell him to stop. So he eats, and the children go a little hungrier, and the sick mother slices thinner, and the German woman upstairs digs a little deeper into her $7 a month. How shall one help it? That's not a question. That's a surrender. There is no way to help it. The old man will eat what he eats. The children will go without. The mother will die eventually. And then what? What happens to the grandfather and the children when there's no one left to sew baby cloaks? The rest is closed for all, the German woman said. Meaning, the future is sealed. Meaning, there's no way out. Meaning, this is how it ends. But there is no shoes for the kinder, she added, and I see not if there will be shoes. The children have no shoes. Winter is coming. Or maybe it's already here. And somewhere in a West Side tenement, there are children aged 16 and 18 whose mother is dying, whose grandfather eats too much, and who don't have shoes. How shall it be? Another non-question, another surrender. She doesn't know how it will be. Nobody knows. The shoes will come or they won't. The children will manage or they won't. The mother will live a little longer, or she won't. And the German woman will keep climbing those stairs, keep buying bread and tea and potatoes for the family downstairs, keep scrubbing her own little room clean, keep eating less than she could, so she can stay a little warm. Because what else is there to do? She could stop. She could keep that $1.60 for herself, buy some butter, buy a little meat, eat until she was full for once. Nobody would blame her. She barely has enough for herself. Taking care of another family when you're 65 years old and earning $2.70 a week isn't noble. It's crazy. But she does it anyway. Maybe because she remembers Lisa. Maybe because she remembers Hans. Maybe because she knows what it feels like to watch someone you love starve, and she can't stand to see it happening again, even to strangers. Maybe because this is who she is. This is who poverty made her. Not broken, not hard, just clear. Clear about what matters. Clear about what you do when there's almost nothing left to give. You give anyway. $1.60 a week. For bread and tea and potatoes. For children who have no shoes. For a dying woman who makes beautiful baby cloaks that wealthy mothers buy for their infants uptown. For an old man who eats too much because how shall one help it? The German woman is standing in her clean little room, her saucepan on the stove, her window letting in what little light the air shaft provides. She's told her story, explained her numbers, shown how it's possible to live on almost nothing if you're careful, if you're disciplined, if you've got 65 years of practice at wanting less than you need. And now she's going to go downstairs and check on the sick girl. See how the baby cloaks are coming along. Maybe bring some soup from that saucepan, if there's enough to share. The interview is over. The numbers are recorded. The story is told. But the story isn't over. Tomorrow, the German woman will wake up in her 10-foot room and count her pennies again. The sick girl will sit at her machine and sew scalloped cuffs onto bright little cloaks. The children will walk barefoot on cold floors. The grandfather will eat too much. And somewhere uptown, a wealthy mother will wrap her baby in one of those beautiful cloaks and never think about the hands that made it. Never wonder about the woman who stitched it while dying. Never imagine the room where it came from, the building, the stairs, the broken sink, the German woman on the 4th floor who buys bread for families that aren't hers because her own family is dead, and she thanks God for it. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The people at the top and the people at the bottom, connected by thread and fabric and money that flows only one direction. The cloak costs maybe $5 in a shop uptown. The girl who made it earned 66 cents. The difference went to the middleman, the factory, the landlord, the system. Everyone got their cut, except the hands that did the work. $8 a dozen. That's the price of skill. That's the price of dying. And somewhere in your future, in your warm bed, you're maybe half asleep by now. Your stomach is full. Your feet are warm. You've never had to choose between food and heat. Never had to thank God that your family died so you wouldn't have to watch them starve. But someone did. A lot of someones. In 1886, in tenements you'll never see, in rooms you'll never visit, they made that choice every day. They survived on bread and tea and hope, on charity from neighbours who had almost nothing to give, on the desperate mathematics of poverty. And some of them, somehow, kept their rooms clean anyway. Why not? In the same building, different floor, there was another woman with a different story. Swiss, this one, and she'd fallen a long way to get here. She used to be a lady's maid. Think about that for a second. A lady's maid in the old country, in the grand houses, wearing nice clothes and eating decent food and learning how to cook from the kitchen staff. That was her life once. Service, sure, but comfortable service. The kind where you sleep in a real bed and eat at a real table and know where your next meal is coming from. Then she came to America, met a man, got married, and he drank. Not a little, a lot. The kind of drinking that eats through savings like fire through paper. Everything she'd saved from her years in service, gone. Everything she earned while married, gone. Down his throat and out the other end, and nothing to show for it but empty bottles and broken promises. By the time the records caught up with her, she was old, too old for household service anymore, which she still ranked as the most comfortable and most profitable work a woman could do. Her body couldn't handle the lifting, the stairs, the long days on her feet, so she'd found other work, factory work, the kind that doesn't care how old you are, as long as your fingers still move. She sewed buckles onto suspenders. $2 a week. That's what her time was worth now. $2 for however many hours they'd give her. The woman who used to serve in grand houses, who used to eat proper food and sleep in a proper bed, was ending her days attaching metal to elastic in a factory that probably smelled like machine oil and desperation. But here's the thing about her, the thing that set her apart from almost everyone else in that building. She could cook. Not just boil water for tea, actually cook. She'd learned as a child, back in Switzerland, and she'd never forgotten. And when the interviewer came to her room, there was a saucepan on her tiny stove, and something inside it smelled like actual food. "All this in the saucepan is 7 cents, she said. 7 cents. She broke it down. 3 cents for bones and some bits that the kind butcher threw in. The rest went to vegetables and barley. And that 7 cents of ingredients made enough soup to feed her for 2 days. I have lentils too, she continued. Yes, and beans, and plenty things to flavour. Lentils, beans, vegetables, barley, real food, actual nutrition, the kind of stuff that builds muscle and keeps bones strong, and gives you energy that doesn't crash an hour later. She was living on less than $1 a week for food, and she was eating better than most people spending twice that. And for Sunday, she bought rye bread and coffee. Not tea. Never tea. "Oh no," she said. "Tea is so wicked. It make handshake and head fly all round." The caffeine, she meant. The jitters. The way tea could make your hands tremble and your thoughts scatter. She'd seen what it did to the women around her, how they depended on it, how they couldn't function without it, and she wanted no part of it. "Good soup is best," she said, "and more when one can. Vegetable is many and salad, and when I make more dollar, I buy some egg, but not tea." She had opinions about bread too. "Not big loaf of white bread," she said. "That swell and swell inside, and when it is gone, leave one also empty." White bread. The cheap American stuff that looked impressive and filled your stomach for an hour and then left you hungrier than before. She'd figured out what the nutritionists wouldn't prove for another 50 years. White bread was mostly air. It puffed up pretty but gave you nothing to hold on to. The dense rye bread, the dark stuff from the German bakeries, that was what kept you going. She tried to teach the others. That was maybe the saddest part. I try sometimes to teach, she said. I give some of my soup and they eat it and say it is good. But they cannot stop to do so much. That is fuss. There's that word again. Fuss. The same word the other women used, the same dismissal. Yes, your soup is good. Yes, we can taste that it's better than what we're eating, but we can't do what you do. We don't have the time. We don't have the energy. We don't have the knowledge. And honestly, even if we did, we probably still wouldn't do it. Because after 14 hours at the machine, the last thing anyone wants is more work. I would teach many, she said, but they like it not. They want only the tea. Always the tea. And here's where we have to talk about tea. Really talk about it. Because it wasn't just a drink in these tenements. It was something more, something darker, something that kept the whole system running. A visitor asked one of the sewing women a reasonable question once. If you all clubbed together, couldn't one cook for you? Make good soup and oatmeal and things that are nourishing? You would be stronger then. And the woman shot back. Stronger for what? Let that sit for a moment. Stronger for what? More hours at the machine, she continued. More grinding your own flesh and bones into flour for them that's over us. That's not self-pity. That's clear-eyed analysis. She understood exactly what was happening. Her body was fuel. Her labour was the product. And the people at the top were extracting every last bit of value from her before she burned out. Getting stronger wouldn't help her. It would help them. She'd just last longer before she broke down. She'd produce more before she died. So why bother? The visitor pressed a little, suggested they could club together, pool resources, take turns cooking. Surely, that would make sense. Mum, the woman said, and you can hear the weariness in it, the patience wearing thin. It's easy to see you mean well, and I won't say but what you know more than some that comes around. What you're talking about, club, we might. I'm not denying it could be done, if there was time. But who of us has the time? Even if she the will. She wasn't wrong, the math didn't work. 14 hours at the machine, commute time on top of that, sleep when you could grab it. Cooking took time, shopping took time. Organising a collective kitchen for a building full of exhausted women took time, that none of them had. And then, she added something that explained a lot. I was never much hand for cooking. We'd tea and bread and a good bit of fried beef or pork maybe, when my husband was alive and at work. He cared not for fancy things like beans and such. When her husband was alive. When there was a man's wage coming in. Even then, they didn't cook much. Tea and bread and fried meat when they could afford it. That was the tradition. That was what she knew. Learning to cook at this point, after decades of doing it one way, felt impossible. Even if she had the time, she didn't have the will. It's the tea that keeps you up, she said. And as long as I can get that, I'll not bother about beans. Tea keeps you up. That was the key. The sewing machine required alertness. 14 hours of focus, guiding fabric under a needle that would happily punch through your finger if you let your attention wander. You couldn't do that work groggy. You couldn't do it sleepy. You needed something to sharpen your mind, to push through the exhaustion, to keep your eyes open and your hands steady when every part of you wanted to collapse. Tea did that. The caffeine, the warmth, the ritual of it, cup after cup throughout the day. Keeping the edge on, keeping the fingers moving, keeping the treadle pumping. The records noted this connection. Tea and the sewing machine, someone wrote, are naturally inseparable allies. and so long as the sewing women must work 14 hours daily, they will remain so. The tea delayed digestion, suppressed appetite, let you work longer on less food. It was the perfect drug for an exploited workforce. Not strong enough to be illegal, not expensive enough to be out of reach, just effective enough to keep the machines running. One woman described the hunger that broke through sometimes. Once in a while, she said, you get raging, tearing hungry. Seems as if you'd swallow a teapot or anything handy to fill up like. Raging, tearing hungry. The kind of hunger that stops being a background sensation and becomes a scream. The kind that makes you want to eat anything, everything, your own hand if it came to that. But that ain't often, she added. Lucky for us. Lucky. She called it lucky that she was usually too tired and too caffeinated to notice how hungry she was. Lucky that the tea suppressed her appetite enough to make the bread and butter seem like enough. Lucky that her body had learned to expect nothing and be grateful for less. The Swiss woman in her room, with her 7-cent soup and her opinions about white bread, was the exception. She'd escaped the tea trap through knowledge and discipline, and maybe just sheer Swiss stubbornness. She ate real food on less money than her neighbours spent on bread and tea, and she was probably healthier for it, but she couldn't teach them. They didn't want to learn. The tea had them, and they had the tea, and together they kept the machines running. There's something almost elegant about it, in a horrible way. A self-sustaining system. Work 14 hours, get paid barely enough to live, spend what you have on food that doesn't nourish, and tea that keeps you working. Stay too tired and too hungry to change anything. Repeat, until you can't anymore. The economists uptown could write their papers about per capita wealth. The factory owners could congratulate themselves on efficiency. The landlords could raise the rent another $1. And down in the tenements, women were grinding their flesh and bones into flour for them that's over us, and calling it lucky when they were too tired to notice. Stronger for what? That question hung in the air of every tenement kitchen. Every time some well-meaning reformer suggested better nutrition, more exercise, self-improvement. Stronger for what? So we can work more hours? So we can produce more goods? So we can make more money for people who already have more than they need? The system didn't want healthy workers. It wanted cheap workers. Workers who would accept 7 cents an hour and be grateful. Workers who would drink tea instead of eating meals because tea cost less. Workers who would wear out and be replaced by the next wave of immigrants willing to do the same. The Swiss woman understood this. The sewing women understood this. Everyone in those buildings understood this. They just couldn't do anything about it. So they drank their tea. They ate their bread. They sat at their machines and pumped the treadles and guided the fabric and watched the clock and tried not to think about tomorrow. And somewhere in that building, on that 4th floor, an old Swiss woman stirred her 7-cent soup and wished someone would let her teach them. Just one person. Just someone who wanted to learn. But they liked it not. Always the tea. The afternoon is wearing on now. You're still in 1886, but the light through the airshaft windows is starting to shift. Golden, almost. The kind of light that makes even the saddest places look briefly beautiful. The sewing machines are still whirring. You can hear them through the walls, through the floors. That constant mechanical heartbeat. Somewhere in this building, Emmy is hunched over her work, earning her 85 cents. Somewhere else, the sick girl is stitching scalloped cuffs onto baby cloaks. Somewhere else, a woman is pouring herself another cup of tea because it's the only thing keeping her eyes open. The Swiss woman had her own history with drink, in a way. Not her own drinking, her husband's. She'd watched alcohol do to a man what the sewing machine did to these women. Consume everything. Leave nothing behind but the shell of what used to be a person. Maybe that's why she avoided the tea. Maybe she saw something familiar in the way her neighbours depended on it, the way they couldn't start the day without it, the way they got irritable when the pot ran dry, the way it had become not a choice but a necessity, woven so deeply into their lives that they couldn't imagine functioning without it. She'd already lost one life to a man who couldn't stop drinking. She wasn't about to lose another to a pot that couldn't stop boiling. So she made her soup instead, bones and vegetables and barley simmering away on her little stove. Real food, actual nourishment, the kind of meal you could feel working inside you, building you up instead of just keeping you awake long enough to work yourself into the ground. 3 cents for bones. The butcher threw in some bits for free because she was old and polite and probably reminded him of someone. The rest went to whatever vegetables were cheapest that day. Cabbage, usually. Onions when she could get them. Potatoes if there was a little extra. Barley to thicken it, to give it body, to make it stick to your ribs in a way that bread and tea never could. 7 cents. 2 days of eating. Real eating. Not the hollow fullness of white bread, not the jittery alertness of tea, just food doing what food was supposed to do. And when she had a little more, she bought eggs. Because eggs were protein. Eggs were strength. Eggs were the closest thing to meat that $1 a week could buy. But not tea. Never tea. The irony is that she probably could have taught them. These women weren't stupid. They were exhausted and trapped. But they weren't stupid. If someone had given them the time, the energy, the space to learn, they could have figured out what the Swiss woman knew. They could have made soup instead of buying bread, could have spent less and eaten better, could have broken the cycle, maybe, one pot of bones at a time. But nobody was giving them that time. That was the whole point. The system ran on their exhaustion. It needed them too tired to think, too desperate to organise, too dependent on tea to imagine any other way. Change required energy, and energy was exactly what the factories were extracting. 14 hours at the machine, 7 cents an hour maybe, legs pumping the treadle until your hips ached, fingers guiding fabric until they cramped, eyes focused on the needle until everything else blurred. And at the end of it, what did you have? 85 cents if you were lucky. Enough to do it again tomorrow. Enough to pay the rent. Enough to buy bread and tea and keep yourself alive just long enough to work yourself to death. Stronger for what? Indeed. The Swiss woman stirred her soup and thought about the grand houses where she used to work. The kitchens with their copper pots and their roasting spits and their bins full of flour. The meals she'd helped prepare for people who never thought twice about where their food came from. The leftovers that the servants got to share after the masters were fed. That was another life, another country, another woman, almost. The one who stood in this tenement room, with her 7-cent soup and her $2 wage, bore little resemblance to the girl who'd learned to cook in a Swiss kitchen 40 years ago. But the knowledge remained. You could take everything else away, the savings, the husband, the youth, the hope, but you couldn't take the knowledge. She still knew how to make something from nothing, still knew which bones had the most flavour, which vegetables stretched the furthest, which combinations made the difference between surviving and actually living, and she would have taught anyone who wanted to learn. But they liked it not. They wanted only the tea. On the 4th floor of a West Side tenement, in a room that measured 10 feet by 10 feet, an old Swiss woman stirred her soup and wished someone would listen. In the rooms below, women hunched over sewing machines and drank their tea and counted the hours until they could collapse into bed. Somewhere upstairs, the German woman was probably buying groceries for the sick girl's family, spending money she didn't have on bread she couldn't afford. And outside, the sun was starting to set over the Hudson River. The nearer the river, the nearer to hell, someone had said. But even hell had its moments of beauty. Even here, in the worst of it, the light could turn golden for a few minutes before dark. You're watching it now. That light. Coming through the airshaft window, catching the dust in the air, making everything look almost peaceful. Almost. But the machines are still running, the tea is still boiling, and tomorrow will be exactly like today. Unless someone decides to learn how to make soup. But that's not going to happen. Not today. Probably not ever. The system is too strong, the exhaustion too deep, the tea too easy. Change would require something breaking, and nothing is breaking yet. Not visibly. Not yet. So the Swiss woman stirs her soup, and the sewing women drink their tea, and the machines keep running, and the sun keeps setting, and 1886 keeps grinding forward, one day at a time. Always the tea, always the machine, always tomorrow. Helen Campbell didn't trust the economists. That's the first thing you need to know about her. She'd read their papers, heard their speeches, watched them wave around census figures like magic wands, as if numbers on a page could make poverty disappear. $900 per capita, they said, the wealth of the nation, equally divided. What madness to talk of suffering. She thought that was garbage, said so too, called them blind as bats to any figures save their own. So she did something different. She went amongst the people themselves, door to door, tenement to tenement, upstairs that sagged and down halls that stank, knocking on doors and asking questions that nobody with money had bothered to ask. How do you live? What do you eat? Where does the money go? Simple questions, devastating answers. One after another, the cases on the west side gave their testimony. The widow with her notebook, the German woman with her 7-cent soup, the Swiss woman who used to be a lady's maid, the sick girl making baby cloaks. Story after story, door after door, the same brutal arithmetic playing out in different rooms. And when Campbell added it all up, when she looked at the pattern that emerged from all those individual stories, she found something that the economists had missed entirely. 90 cents. That was the average. 90 cents per week per person for food. Not the fancy stuff, not even the adequate stuff, just the absolute minimum that kept a human being walking and talking and working. Baker's bread, tea, sugar, a little milk, a little butter, a bit of meat once or twice a week, if you were lucky. 90 cents a week, about 13 cents a day. That's what survival cost in 1886 Manhattan, if you stripped it down to nothing, if you cut every corner, if you ate only what you needed to keep breathing, and most people couldn't even manage that without sacrifice. The German woman on the 4th floor spent less than that. 50 cents a week, sometimes 60. She did it by eating less than she could, by choosing warmth over food, by thanking God that her family was dead so she didn't have to watch them starve. The widow downstairs spent more, but she had Emmy to think about. And even then, no meat except Sundays, no shoes for 2 years. Every penny tracked in a notebook because the margin for error was exactly 0. The sick girl making baby cloaks couldn't even earn enough to hit that 90-cent average. $5 a week for a household of 4. That's $1.25 per person. Subtract $5.50 for rent, and you're already in the hole before you've bought a single loaf of bread. Campbell found this pattern everywhere she went, the same foods appearing on the same tables, the same calculations being made in the same cramped kitchens. It wasn't that these women lacked imagination. It wasn't that they didn't know about vegetables or beans or the nutritional value of a balanced diet. It was that the system had them trapped. See, everything in those tenements was bought in small quantities. Not because people wanted it that way, because they had no choice. Coal by the scuttle, 12 cents for a bucket's worth, which sounds reasonable until you realise that a ton of coal cost maybe $5 or $6 if you bought it all at once. By the time you'd filled enough scuttles to make a ton, you'd spent $12, double the price. Wood by the bundle, oil by the quart, provisions sold in tiny amounts at maximum markup. The grocer knew, the coal merchant knew, the landlord knew. Everyone who sold anything to the poor knew exactly what they were doing. You couldn't buy wholesale because you didn't have the money up front. You couldn't store in bulk because you didn't have the space. You couldn't plan ahead, because you never knew if next week would bring work or illness, or some new disaster that ate through whatever you'd managed to save. So you paid more for less. Day after day, scuttle after scuttle, bundle after bundle. The poverty penalty applied to everything you touched, and the same fact applied to all provisions sold. That's the part that burns, if you let yourself think about it. The sellers knew they were extracting extra profit from people who could least afford it. They knew the math. They knew that selling coal by the scuttle meant double the profit per tonne. They did it anyway, because the poor would pay it, because the poor had to pay it, because when the alternative is freezing, you'll pay whatever they ask. Campbell tracked all of this, documented it, wrote it down in careful columns, the same way the widow wrote in her notebook. Receipts for everything, testimony from everyone. Not fanciful pictures, she insisted, just the truth, as it actually existed in the tenements. And the truth was simple. The system was designed to extract wealth from the people who had the least of it. But the West Side wasn't the only side. Manhattan had two sides to its poverty, and they were different in ways that mattered. The West Side, down toward the Hudson, that was Irish territory mostly. Dockworkers' families, day labourers, the carpenter who said the nearer the river, the nearer to hell. That whole stretch of misery from the slaughterhouses north to the edge of respectable neighbourhoods. The East Side was different. Denser, for one thing, more packed. The tenements there weren't just buildings, they were cities within cities, stacked 5 and 6 stories high, crammed with families in every available inch of space. And the people were different too. Germans in Kleindeutschland, Little Germany they called it, whole blocks where you could walk for hours and never hear a word of English. Bakers making that dense rye bread, butchers selling liverwurst and blood sausage, beer halls where the men gathered after work. A culture transplanted whole from the old country, trying to survive in the new one. Russian Jews arriving by the thousands, fleeing pogroms that most Americans couldn't imagine, settling in the blocks around Rivington Street, Hester Street, Division Street, bringing their trades with them, tailoring mostly, the needle trades. Men and women and children bent over sewing machines in rooms that were also kitchens, that were also bedrooms. Italians in the Mulberry Bend. The worst blocks in the city, some said. Bandits' Roost, Bottle Alley. Names that told you everything you needed to know about the reputation of the place. Rag pickers and labourers, the newest arrivals, taking whatever work they could find at whatever wages were offered. Each group had its own version of poverty, its own food, its own customs, its own ways of stretching nothing into something. The German women made soups like the Swiss woman did, when they could. The Jewish families observed the Sabbath even when there was barely bread to bless. The Italian grandmothers kept their kitchens clean the way the German woman kept her room clean, because some things you held on to no matter what. The Jewish tailors on the east side worked in conditions that made the west side look almost comfortable. Whole families in a single room, father at one machine, mother at another, children pulling threads and sorting buttons and doing whatever small tasks their small hands could manage. The work never stopped. Dawn to midnight, sometimes later. 15 hours, 16 hours, 18 during the busy season when the orders piled up and the contractors demanded more. They called it the sweating system, and they weren't being poetic. A contractor would take a bulk order from a factory, then he'd farm it out to tenement workers, paying by the piece, keeping the difference as profit. The workers got less than factory rates. The contractor got his cut. The factory got its goods without having to worry about workspace or conditions, or how many children were being worked half to death in the process. In one room on Essex Street, a family of 6 made knee pants. The pay was 45 cents a dozen. Think about that. 45 cents for 12 pairs of pants. Each pair required cutting, stitching, finishing. Figure 4 or 5 hours of work for a dozen, minimum, divided among the whole family. That's less than 10 cents an hour split between 6 people. Pennies per person, per hour of labour. And they were grateful for the work, because without it, there was nothing. The Italian neighbourhoods had their own rhythm. organ grinders on the corners, vegetable vendors pushing carts through the streets, the smell of garlic and olive oil in buildings where the stairs creaked in different languages than the West Side stairs. The rag pickers worked those blocks. Men and women who went through the city's trash looking for anything that could be sold. Bones for the glue factories, rags for the paper mills, bits of metal, scraps of leather, anything with value. They'd push their carts through the streets at dawn, picking through what others had thrown away, converting garbage into survival. At the bottom of that hierarchy were the children, the newsboys, the bootblacks, the little ones who sold matches on corners or swept crossings for tips. Some of them had families, some of them didn't. Some of them slept in doorways or under docks, or in the makeshift shelters that grew up in vacant lots. These weren't orphans necessarily. Plenty of them had parents who needed every cent the children could bring home. Parents who couldn't afford to let their kids be kids, because childhood was a luxury, and luxuries cost money. A boy selling newspapers could make maybe 30 cents a day if he was good at it, if he was loud enough, quick enough, knew which corners got the most traffic. That 30 cents went straight home, not to his pocket, not to his future, to tonight's dinner, if there was going to be one. The math was the same everywhere. That was the thing Campbell kept finding. Different neighbourhoods, different nationalities, different traditions, but the same brutal arithmetic underneath it all. 90 cents a week for food on average. More if you could manage it, less if you couldn't. Rent that ate half your wages or more. Coal by the scuttle because you couldn't afford a ton. Work that paid 7 cents an hour if you were lucky. Children who helped when they were old enough. And always, the question of what to cut when there wasn't enough. Campbell found the same pattern on both sides of the city. The same desperate calculations. The same faces aged beyond their years. The same hands worn raw by work that paid almost nothing. The West Side story was plain, she concluded after all her interviews. But for such returns as the East has to offer, there is still room for further detail. Further detail, meaning more stories, more notebooks, more doors to knock on and stairs to climb. The work wasn't done. The suffering wasn't fully documented. She'd scratched the surface of something enormous, and she knew it. But let's stay here for a moment, in the space between East and West, in the understanding that poverty wasn't one thing but many things, each with its own face and its own flavour, and its own particular form of misery. The widow in her first-floor rooms, counting her scissors sharpening money. The German woman on the 4th floor, buying bread for families that weren't hers. The sick girl stitching baby cloaks that rich mothers would coo over. The Swiss woman stirring soup that nobody wanted to learn how to make. All of them trapped in the same machine. All of them running the same calculations. All of them coming up short in different ways that added up to the same thing. Not enough. Never enough. And outside the tenements, the city kept moving. Carriages uptown, businessmen in their suits, shopgirls window dressing for customers who could afford to browse, newsboys hawking papers that praised the economy, quoted the economists, celebrated the $900 per capita that everyone theoretically had. The widow had her notebook. Helen Campbell had her notes. The numbers told the truth, even when everyone else was lying. 90 cents a week, 12 cents a scuttle, 85 cents a day for 14 hours of work, 2 years without shoes, $1.60 for someone else's groceries, $0 for anything that looked like hope. The evening is settling over Manhattan now. The light through the airshaft windows has gone from gold to grey to something like purple. The sewing machines are slowing down. Somewhere in the building, a woman is making a final pot of tea before bed. Somewhere else, children are being told to sleep even though they're hungry. And you're still here, still listening, still warm in your bed, in your future that none of them could imagine. Think about that for a second. The widow with no shoes couldn't picture you, couldn't conceive of a world where someone would be warm and fed and safe, listening to her story as if it were entertainment. To her, this wasn't a story. It was Tuesday. It was Wednesday. It was every day for 11 years in a tenement on the west side, counting pennies and hoping tomorrow would be different. It wasn't entertainment. It was survival. And the worst part? She was one of the lucky ones. She had Emmy. She had work. She had a roof and a notebook and a system that kept her just barely above the line. Plenty of others didn't have even that. Campbell found them too. The ones who'd fallen through every safety net that existed. Women who'd been abandoned by husbands who just walked out one day and never came back. Women whose husbands had died in factory accidents or dock mishaps, leaving nothing behind but debt and children. Women who'd never married at all, who'd made one mistake in their youth and were still paying for it decades later. They called them soul earners, and the phrase itself tells you something. Soul, as in only, as in alone, as in nobody else to help, nobody else to lean on, nobody else to split the rent with or share the bread with or watch the children while you worked. Being a soul earner in 1886 Manhattan was a slow-motion drowning. You could see the surface. You could almost reach it sometimes. But every time you got close, something pulled you back down. Illness, an injury, a slow season when the work dried up, a landlord raising the rent because he could. The women who survived as soul earners did it through miracles of calculation and sacrifice. They gave up shoes. They gave up heat. They gave up food, eating less than their bodies needed so they could afford rent, afford coal, afford to send their children to school in something other than rags. And the ones who couldn't survive that way? Nobody talked about that too openly. But Campbell knew. Everyone knew. The path from seamstress to something else wasn't a secret. It was just a silence. A thing that happened to women who couldn't make the math work, who couldn't stretch nothing far enough, who couldn't face another day of bread and tea and bread and tea. One woman had told Campbell, "Let God Almighty judge who's to blame most. I tried honest work. I tried it till I give out. Till I give out." That's what it came down to. Everyone had a breaking point. Everyone had a number, some combination of circumstances that would push them past what they could bear. For some, it was hunger. For others, watching their children go without. For others, the simple exhaustion of fighting a fight that couldn't be won. The system didn't care about breaking points. The system just kept running, kept demanding labour, kept paying 7 cents an hour, kept selling coal by the scuttle at double the wholesale rate, kept grinding your own flesh and bones into flour for them that's over us. And every morning, somewhere in the city, a woman woke up and decided to keep fighting, to make the tea, to eat the bread, to sit at the machine, to try, one more day, to make the impossible math somehow work. That's what gets you, really. Not the suffering itself, though that was real enough, but the dailiness of it, the way it just kept going. Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, week after week, year after year. No dramatic climax, no sudden rescue, just the slow accumulation of days that added up to a life. The widow had been at it for 11 years when Campbell found her. 11 years in that building. 11 years of notebooks and calculations. 11 years of making it work when it shouldn't have worked at all. And she was still hoping for a change. Still believing that something might shift. That Emmy might find her chance. That the numbers might somehow, someday, add up to something more than bare survival. That hope is the thing that breaks your heart a little. Not because it was foolish, because it was necessary. Because without it, the tea and the bread and the machine would have been unbearable. Hope was the only luxury they could afford, and they spent it freely. Somewhere in your own time, the night has grown deeper. The stories have settled into you now. These women you'll never meet, whose names are mostly lost, whose struggles ended long before you were born. They've taken up residence somewhere in your memory. And somehow, impossibly, they kept going anyway. The work had seasons. That's something you don't think about when you imagine factories and sewing machines. You picture constant, steady labour, same work day after day, week after week. But it wasn't like that. The garment trade had busy times and dull times, and the difference between them could mean the difference between surviving and sinking. The busy season hit in late summer and early fall, when the factories geared up for winter clothes, coats, suits, heavy things that took time to make. That's when the piece rates were best, when there was more work than hands to do it, when a skilled seamstress might actually get ahead for once. Then came the dull season, the dead months when orders dropped off and contractors stopped sending work, and whole floors of tenement workers sat idle at their machines. January, February, March. The coldest months of the year, when you needed coal the most, and that's exactly when the income dried up. Children's suits with skirts and such things, the widow had said. That's what she and Emmy sewed during the dull seasons. The lighter stuff. The work that nobody else wanted because the pay was worse. But something was better than nothing, and they'd learned not to be picky. In the busy season, she'd said, we made $15 a week sometimes. $15. That was real money. That was the kind of money you could actually live on. Rent paid with room to spare. Food that included more than bread and tea. Maybe even a little put aside for the next dull season, for the next emergency, for the next time the math didn't work. We could have got ahead, she said. Could have. The saddest words in the language. There was a debt, see? Her husband's debt. Not much, probably, by the standards of people with money, but it existed, this claim against his name, and she couldn't leave it standing. We'd never owed anybody a penny, she explained. That had been their pride, hers and her husband's. The one thing they'd held on to through everything else. They paid what they owed. They didn't take charity. They didn't leave debts behind. So she'd paid it off. Every cent, cleared his name, did the honourable thing. And then, the rheumatic fever hit. That's how fast things turned. 1 month you're earning $15 a week and thinking about getting ahead. The next month you're flat on your back with a fever that settles into your joints and never quite leaves. And by the time you're well enough to work again, if you ever really are, the prices have dropped and the good times are over, and all that talk about getting ahead feels like a joke someone told a long time ago. The widow never got her full strength back. She could help with small things, light work, but the 14-hour days at the machine were beyond her now. That burden fell entirely on Emmy. Emmy was an expert. Her mother said that with something like pride. I never knew her make a mistake. The girl could sew anything, do it fast, do it right, but expert or not, the rates kept falling. 18 months of working 12 and 14-hour days, mostly 14, and the most Emmy had made in all that time was 85 cents a day. That's where they lived now, in that narrow space between what used to be and what was. Emmy working herself raw at the machine, her mother keeping the books, patching her shoes with scraps from her dead husband's coat, hoping for a change. I'm always hoping for a change, she'd said. And a chance for Emmy. A chance. That's what mothers wanted for their daughters, even in places like this, especially in places like this. Not the same life repeated, not another generation at the machine, wearing out their eyes and their backs and their youth for 7 cents an hour. Something better, something different, a chance. What that chance might look like she probably couldn't say. Maybe Emmy would meet someone, a man with a steady job, a man who didn't drink, a man who would take her away from this building and this neighbourhood and this endless grinding poverty. Maybe Emmy would find different work somehow, something that paid better, something that didn't require 14 hours of treadle pumping just to earn less than $1. Or maybe nothing would change. Maybe Emmy would grow old at that machine, just like the women around her were growing old. Maybe in 20 years she'd be the one patching her shoes with scraps, the one counting pennies in a notebook, the one hoping for a change that never came. That's the thing about hope. It doesn't need to be realistic to keep you going. The widow kept to herself mostly. She said that clearly. It always seemed to me best to keep quite to myself, for many reasons. She didn't elaborate on the reasons. Didn't have to. In a building full of strangers, in a neighbourhood where everyone was struggling, keeping to yourself meant avoiding entanglements, meant not getting pulled into other people's disasters, meant protecting the little you had from the many hands that might reach for it. But she wasn't alone. Not entirely. There was the German woman on the 4th floor, the one who fell on the ice last winter and sprained her ankle. And we saw to her well as we could till she got better, the widow said. Saw to her, meaning checked on her, brought her food probably, helped her up and down the stairs, did whatever needed doing for an old woman who couldn't walk and had nobody else. 2 families barely surviving, and still, when one of them fell, the other one helped. That's how it worked in the tenements. Not grand gestures, not charity committees or reform societies, just neighbours looking out for neighbours, sharing what little they had, because everyone knew how close they all were to the edge. The German woman who fell could have been the widow, could have been anyone. Next time, it might be. And when that happened, you'd want someone to see to you. There was the boy upstairs too, the one who brought a basket of wood scraps. They're building down the street, the widow explained, and one of the boys upstairs brought me a basket full of bits. A kid, probably. One of the children swarming on the stairs and in the halls, the ones who got underfoot, the ones who made noise and trouble and wore out their shoes playing in the streets. One of those kids had thought of the widow, had seen the construction site, seen the scraps, made the connection. She needed fuel. The scraps were free. He gathered them up and carried them to her door. That basket of wood meant 5 cents saved. 5 cents that could go toward food instead of fuel. 5 cents that made the difference between an expensive week and a manageable one. A small thing. A child's kindness. But in the arithmetic of survival, small things were everything. Nobody was tracking these exchanges. Nobody kept a ledger of favours given and favours owed. It just happened. The boy with the wood, the widow caring for the German woman buying groceries for the sick girl downstairs. Networks of help that grew up organically, without planning, because that's what humans did. Even here, even now, even when there was barely enough for yourself. But help had limits. You couldn't save everyone. You couldn't fix everything. When the rheumatic fever came, when the prices dropped, when the landlord raised the rent, when winter hit and the work dried up, all the baskets of wood in the world couldn't change the fundamental math. The German woman spent $1.60 a week on groceries for the sick girl's family. That was nearly a quarter of her income, generous by any measure, and it still wasn't enough. The children still had no shoes. The grandfather still ate too much. The sick girl was still dying, one baby cloak at a time. Help could soften the edges. It couldn't change the shape. And sometimes, even help became impossible. When everyone was struggling, when everyone was short, when the dull season stretched on and the work didn't come, the networks frayed. People who'd been generous in November became cautious in February. The basket of wood didn't appear. The extra groceries didn't get bought. Everyone pulled inward, protecting what little they had, waiting for the busy season that might not come. The building itself seemed to reflect these rhythms. In summer, children played in the halls. Voices echoed in the air shaft. There was life, of a sort, crowded and loud and messy. In winter, doors stayed closed. People moved quickly, hunched against the cold, saving their energy and their words. The smell of the broken sink seemed stronger when the windows were sealed. The darkness lasted longer when no one could afford enough oil to fight it. The widow had lived in that building for 11 years. She knew its seasons, knew which neighbours could be counted on and which couldn't, knew the sound of the stairs at different times of day, the pattern of footsteps that meant Emmy coming home, the particular creak of the floorboards outside her door. 11 years. Longer than some marriages. Longer than many jobs. She put down roots in a place she'd never intended to stay, in a life she'd never expected to live. Greenwich Village was a memory now. The respectable street, the house where you could have the relations over, that was someone else's life. This was hers. First floor, 2 rooms, a notebook full of numbers, a daughter who never made mistakes, a neighbour upstairs who fell on the ice and needed looking after, a boy who sometimes brought wood. It wasn't much. It wasn't what she'd wanted or planned or dreamed about in her younger days, but it was something. A community of sorts, a life, even if it looked nothing like the life she'd imagined. "They've raised $1 on me twice," she'd said about the rent. In 11 years, 2 rent increases, $1 each time. She remembered both of them, marked them in her mind like wounds, because $1 wasn't just $1 when you were living this close to the edge. $1 was meals, $1 was coal, $1 was the difference between holding on and falling off. And still, she'd held on. 11 years, through the dull seasons and the busy seasons, through the debt and the fever, through the prices falling and the work getting harder. She'd held on because Emmy needed her, because the notebook needed keeping, because you didn't just give up. You kept hoping for a change, even if the change never came. The night is fully dark now, outside those tenement windows. The air shafts have gone from grey to black. The sewing machines have finally stopped, at least in this building, at least for these few hours. Women are sleeping in rooms you've visited tonight. Emmy curled up somewhere, resting her hands for tomorrow. The German woman on the 4th floor, in her spotless 10-foot room. The sick girl downstairs, probably coughing in her sleep, her bright baby cloaks piled by the machine she'll return to at dawn. Think about what years of this did to a body. The treadle-powered machine worked on leg strength, both feet pumping all day, hour after hour, driving the needle up and down. By the end of a 14-hour shift, your thighs burned, your hips ached, your lower back felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. And that was just one day. Now multiply it by weeks, by months, by years, by decades for the women who lasted that long. The hunching was worse in some ways, leaning over the needle, guiding fabric with your fingers, squinting in whatever light you could manage. Your spine curved forward, your shoulders rounded, the muscles in your neck knotted up and never quite released. Women in their 30s moved like women in their 60s. Women in their 40s looked ancient. And the eyes. God, the eyes. Sewing demanded precision, fine stitches, straight seams, the kind of close work that strained your vision every minute of every hour. In good light it was hard. In the dim glow of an air shaft window or a kerosene lamp, it was brutal. Women went half blind doing this work. By the time they were old, many of them couldn't see well enough to sew anymore, which meant they couldn't earn anymore, which meant they either found other work or they didn't survive at all. The hands cramped. Fingers that had guided thousands of yards of fabric through machines lost their dexterity. Joints swelled, knuckles thickened. The fine motor control that made a seamstress valuable slowly disappeared, taken by the same work that required it, and the lungs. In the garment shops, the air was full of tiny fibres, cloth dust that you breathed in all day, every day. It coated the inside of your chest, made you cough, made it harder to breathe. Some women developed what the doctors would later call industrial diseases, though in 1886 nobody had a name for it. They just knew that long-time seamstresses had trouble breathing and died younger than they should have. The sick girl making baby cloaks downstairs. Nobody said what was wrong with her, exactly. Just that she was sick. that she couldn't go out anymore, that she would die soon, and care not. Maybe it was tuberculosis, the white plague that swept through the tenements. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the body finally giving out after years of too much work and not enough food. She was young enough to have children who couldn't earn yet. 16 and 18, the German woman had said, which meant the sick girl herself was probably in her 30s, maybe early 40s. Young, by any reasonable measure. Too young to be dying. But reason had nothing to do with it. The machine took what it took. The work demanded what it demanded, and bodies wore out at whatever pace the poverty set for them. Emmy was still young, still strong, still an expert who never made mistakes. But her mother watched her work those 14-hour days, and somewhere in the back of her mind she had to know. This was Emmy's future. This was what waited. The curved spine, the failing eyes, the cramped hands, the cough that wouldn't go away, unless a change came, unless a chance appeared. The widow kept hoping because hope was free. It didn't cost anything to imagine Emmy's life turning out differently. It didn't hurt anything to picture some other future, some way out, some door that might open unexpectedly. But hope didn't change the math. Hope didn't slow down the machine. Hope didn't give Emmy's body the rest it needed, or the food it deserved. Hope was just hope, and sometimes that was all you had. The women in these tenements rarely talked about their bodies. The pain was too constant to mention, too universal to seem worth noting. Everyone ached, everyone struggled, everyone was wearing out. Complaining about it would be like complaining about gravity, so they didn't complain. They just kept working, kept sewing, kept pumping the treadle and hunching over the needle and squinting in the bad light. Kept going until they couldn't anymore. And then they found out what happened to people who couldn't work. Some went to the poorhouse, the big institutions on Blackwell's Island, where the city put its failures. The old, the sick, the mad, the desperate. Nobody wanted to end up there. The poorhouse was where you went when every other option had run out, when there was nobody left to help, when hope finally died for good. Some moved in with family, if they had any, became burdens on daughters or sons or nieces who were barely surviving themselves, added another mouth to feed, another body to house, another set of needs to a budget that was already impossible. Some just disappeared, stopped paying rent, moved out in the night, ended up somewhere worse, or nowhere at all. The records didn't track them. Helen Campbell couldn't find them. They slipped through the cracks and vanished, leaving behind empty rooms that filled up immediately with new tenants starting the same cycle. And some kept going anyway. The widow with no shoes, the German woman on the 4th floor, the Swiss woman making soup from bones, women who'd been worn down but not worn out, who'd found some narrow, sustainable path through the impossible math, who'd learned to survive on less, and less, and less. They were the success stories, in a way. The ones who made it work. The ones who were still there to tell their stories when Helen Campbell came knocking. But even they were waiting for the next illness, the next rent increase, the next dull season that stretched too long, the next thing that would finally push them past what they could bear. 11 years in that building, the widow had said. 11 years of holding on. 11 years of notebooks and calculations and hope. How many more years did she have? How many more could Emmy give? Nobody knew. Nobody could know. You just kept going until you couldn't, and then you found out what happened next. Your own breath has probably slowed a bit by now, the rhythm of these lives settling into something quieter in your mind. The widow kept a notebook because it helped her survive. I'm telling you stories for a different reason. So you know. So someone remembers. So these women who fought so hard for so little don't disappear entirely into the past. They mattered. Their struggles mattered. Their small kindnesses mattered. The basket of wood and the groceries bought for neighbours and the caring for the German woman when she fell. All of it mattered. It just wasn't enough to save them. Nothing was. But here's the thing about people. Even in the worst of it, they found ways to be human. Emmy liked clams. That's such a small detail, such a nothing detail really. But her mother remembered it, mentioned it, held on to it. Emmy never wants much, she said. Running a machine all day seems to take your appetite. But she likes clams. Clams were cheap in New York, plentiful in the waters around Manhattan, sold by vendors on the streets, turned into chowders in the cheaper eating houses. For a few pennies, you could have something that tasted like something briny and fresh and different from the endless bread and tea. They'd had clams twice that month. The widow marked it in her notebook, probably. An extravagance, maybe. An unnecessary expense. But Emmy liked them. And sometimes that was enough reason. Sometimes you spent money you shouldn't have spent because your daughter liked something and you wanted to see her enjoy it. The notebook tracked everything. Every penny in, every penny out. But between the lines, if you knew how to read them, were these small acts of love. Clams for Emmy, a bit of meat on Sunday, the newspaper they wanted to see sometimes. We do want to see a paper sometimes, the widow said, almost apologetic about it, like wanting to know what was happening in the world was an indulgence she needed to justify. But a newspaper cost a penny or two, and a penny or two was food, was fuel, was survival. Reading the news wasn't a necessity, it was a luxury. And yet she bought it anyway, sometimes. She and Emmy sitting together in their two small rooms, passing the pages back and forth, finding out what was happening beyond their walls. That's where she'd learned about the cabbage water soup. Read it in a paper a good while ago, she said. A quart of the water the cabbage was boiled in, a cup of milk, a bit of butter, some flour to thicken. You wouldn't think it could be good, she said. But it is, and it goes a good way. The newspaper had taught her that. Some article somewhere, written by someone who probably never imagined their reader would be a widow in a West Side tenement, stretching 12 cents a day as far as it could possibly go. But she'd read it, and remembered it, and used it. Knowledge shared across the distance between lives that would never otherwise touch. Sundays were different. In all the poverty and struggle, Sunday stood apart. The machines stopped, or at least slowed. The shops closed. The rush and noise of the week gave way to something quieter, something almost peaceful. A bit of meat on Sundays sometimes, the widow had said. That was the ritual, the small indulgence that marked the day as special. Not much meat, a scrap really, enough to flavour a pot of something, to make the meal feel like a meal instead of just fuel to keep working. The German woman on the 4th floor bought milk on Sundays. Just Sundays. A single cent's worth, to put in her coffee or her tea or whatever small comfort she allowed herself on the one day that wasn't about survival. The Swiss woman with the savoury soup bought coffee for Sunday. Rye bread and coffee. Her Sunday breakfast, different from every other morning, marking the day as something worth marking. These weren't holidays. These weren't celebrations. They were just tiny variations in the endless sameness. Small signals that said, today is different. Today, just for a moment, we're not only surviving, we're living. The churches filled on Sundays. Catholic churches for the Irish, Lutheran churches for the Germans, synagogues for the Jewish families on the east side. Whatever faith people carried with them, Sunday was when they practiced it, or Saturday for the Jews. The one day when work gave way to something else, when the grinding stopped and there was room for prayer, for community, for hope. Lord, help us all. That's what the widow said. Not a prayer exactly, more of a sigh. An acknowledgement that help, if it came, would have to come from somewhere beyond her notebook and her careful calculations. She'd done everything she could do. The rest was up to something larger. But faith wasn't only about asking for help. It was about belonging somewhere, being part of something, sitting in a pew beside your neighbours, singing the same songs, hearing the same words, feeling for an hour or two like you weren't alone in this. The tenements could be lonely. The widow kept to herself, she said. Best to keep quite to myself, for many reasons. But loneliness was heavy. It wore on you in ways that hunger and cold didn't. And Sunday, in the churches, that loneliness lifted a little. You were surrounded by people who understood, people fighting the same fight, people who would nod at you and mean it. Then there was the dress. The month before, when the widow's hands weren't so stiff and she could help Emmy with the sewing, they'd earned a little more. $26.70. A good month. Not good enough to get ahead, but good enough for something extra. Emmy got 2 remnants for $1.80 at Eric's. Eric's was probably a shop in the neighbourhood. Dry goods, fabrics, notions. The kind of place where a working girl could find remnants, the leftover pieces from bolts of cloth, sold cheap because they weren't enough for a full garment. But if you knew what you were doing, if you were clever with scissors and thread, you could make something from those remnants, something that looked like something. And I made her a dress that looks very well, the widow said. You can hear the pride in that. Even through the poverty, through the exhaustion, through all of it. She'd made her daughter a dress. Used her skills, the same skills that earned their living, to create something beautiful for Emmy. Something that looked very well. But she's nothing but patchwork underneath, the widow added. And I'm the same, only worse. That's the image that stays with you. Emmy going out into the world in a dress that looked respectable, that looked like she belonged to a different life than the one she actually lived. And underneath, hidden from view, nothing but patches. The truth she carried beneath the surface, the constant mending, the making do, the stretching and stretching until there was nothing left to stretch. I'm the same, only worse. The widow hadn't had new shoes in 2 years. She patched the ones she had with scraps from her dead husband's coat. She never went out anymore, so it didn't matter how her shoes looked. But Emmy had to go out. Emmy had to present herself to the world. Emmy needed the dress that looked very well, even if it was lies all the way down. That dress was love made visible. Hours of work the widow couldn't really afford to do, her stiff hands fighting the needle, creating something pretty for her daughter. Because Emmy deserved pretty things. Because the world was hard enough without looking like you'd been beaten by it. Because sometimes, love is a dress made of remnants that looks very well. And somewhere uptown, a baby would wear one of the bright cloaks that the sick girl sewed. Scalloped cuffs, 2 linings, all hem inside, done so nice. 66 cents for 2 days of dying labour. The baby's mother would never know, would never think about the hands that made the cloak, the room where it was sewn, the children with no shoes waiting for their mother to finish another one. That's how the city worked, the visible and the invisible. The dress that looked very well and the patchwork underneath. The bright baby cloak and the dark tenement room. Layers of reality that never touched, that existed in the same city without ever meeting. The women in the tenements understood this, the gap between appearance and reality, the effort required to maintain any dignity at all. They saw each other's patched up surfaces and knew what was underneath. They didn't judge. How could they? They were all patchwork underneath. There were other small pleasures, things that cost nothing, but still mattered. Sometimes Emmy worked downtown. The widow mentioned it, buried in the numbers. Emmy's car fares when she goes out. For sometimes she works downtown, and only evenings at home. The streetcar cost money, 60 cents a week, $2.70 for the month. Money they couldn't really spare. But the downtown work paid better, probably, or was steadier, or offered something the home sewing didn't. So Emmy rode the streetcar, rattling through the city, watching Manhattan scroll past the windows. Think about that ride for a minute. Emmy, exhausted from 14-hour days, sitting on a streetcar bench, moving through neighbourhoods she'd never live in, passing shops she'd never enter, houses she'd never visit, lives she'd never lead. The city enormous around her, full of possibility that wasn't possible. Not for her, not with her patchwork dress and her machine-worn hands, but still. The ride itself, the motion, the brief rest between work and more work. Maybe she watched the other passengers. Maybe she looked out the window at the buildings and the crowds. Maybe, for those few minutes between the tenement and the factory, she could imagine being someone else. Someone whose life wasn't measured in cents and stitches. Then the streetcar stopped, and she got off and went back to work. But the ride was something, a small daily journey that broke up the sameness. A few minutes of being carried instead of carrying. The children playing in the halls and on the stoops, the sound of their voices, their games, their arguments. Life going on despite everything. New generations growing up in these cramped rooms, learning to survive the way their parents had learned, finding joy in the spaces between hardship. The children didn't know they were poor. Not really. Not the way their parents knew it. To them, the tenement was just home. The narrow rooms, the dark stairs, the shared privy in the yard. That was normal. That was the world. So they played, made games out of nothing, chased each other through the halls, annoying the adults who were trying to work or sleep, drew pictures in the dust, told stories they'd heard from their grandmothers, fought over scraps of nothing, and made up 5 minutes later. The sick girl downstairs had children. 16 and 18, the German woman had said. Old enough to work, but young enough to still need shoes. Caught in that terrible gap between childhood and earning, when you were big enough to be a burden but not skilled enough to help. Those children probably ran errands for their mother, fetched water from the pump, carried the finished baby cloaks down to wherever they needed to go. Small tasks that kept the household running while their mother coughed at her machine. Learning, without being taught, what their lives would become. The boy upstairs who brought the widow her basket of wood scraps, he was probably a child too, one of the many swarming through the building, getting underfoot. But he'd noticed the construction site, noticed the scraps, made the connection, gathered them up and carried them to the widow's door. Kindness learned, young, survival instincts that would serve him all his life. How to see opportunity where others saw nothing. How to help your neighbours because someday you'd need help too. The tenements taught these lessons without meaning to. The children absorbed them like they absorbed everything else. The smell of someone's cooking, drifting through the building. The Swiss woman's savoury soup, maybe. 7 cents worth of bones and vegetables that filled 2 days and made the whole floor smell like someone's home. Gossip exchanged on the stairs. News about who was sick, who had found work, who had lost it. The small currency of information that connected people to each other, made them feel like neighbours instead of just strangers sharing walls. Music, sometimes. Someone with an accordion or a fiddle, playing in the evenings when the work was done. Old songs from the old country, wherever the old country was. Ireland or Germany or Italy, or the shtetls of Eastern Europe. Music that reminded people who they'd been before they came here, who they still were underneath the poverty. Laughter, even here, even now. Jokes told in tired voices, shared amusement at the absurdity of it all, the dark humour of people who'd seen too much to be shocked by anything anymore. Finding something funny because the alternative was crying, and crying didn't help anything. These moments didn't change the math, didn't add hours to the day or cents to the wages, didn't make the work less grinding or the hunger less real, but they made the days bearable, gave people reasons to keep going beyond simple survival. If it weren't for Emmy's missing me, the widow said, it would be better for me to die. For I'm no use, you see, and times get no better but worse. That's as dark as it gets. A mother saying she'd be better off dead, that she's a burden now, not a help. that her continued existence only makes things harder for the daughter she loves. But she kept living, not for herself, for Emmy, because Emmy would miss her, because Emmy needed someone to keep the notebook, to make the cabbage water soup, to sew the dress from remnants, because love tied them together, even when logic said the knot should break. "But I can't," she said, "and we must get along somehow. We must get along somehow." That was the creed of the Tenements, the faith that kept people moving when everything said stop. Not hope exactly, something grimmer and more stubborn than hope. Just the determination to keep going because going was the only option, because the alternative was unthinkable, because somewhere in the future, maybe, things might be different. Lord, help us all. The prayers rose from 1,000 tenement windows, from Irish widows and German grandmothers and Italian mothers and Jewish fathers, from children too young to understand what they were praying for and old people too tired to believe anymore. All of them asking for the same thing: help, relief, a chance. Some of those prayers got answered. Some of those families found their way to something better. Jobs that paid more, children who grew up strong, small breaks that snowballed into real change. But most of them didn't. Most of them stayed right where they were, praying and working and surviving until they couldn't anymore. The prayers went up and nothing came down, and still they prayed, because prayer was free and hope was all they had. Your bed is warm, your stomach is full, your shoes aren't patched with scraps from a dead man's coat. But the prayers still echo somehow, across all those years. Lord, help us all. The voice of a widow in a first-floor room, asking for something she never got. Still asking, still hoping, still holding on, because Emmy would miss her. We must get along somehow. And somehow, against all odds, they did. Helen Campbell had a target. She wasn't just collecting sad stories. She wasn't just documenting poverty for poverty's sake. She was building a case. And the case was against the men in their offices and lecture halls who kept insisting that the problem didn't exist. The professional political economist of the old school, she called them, the experts, the authorities, the men whose thinking shaped policy and public opinion. And what did they say when anyone talked about suffering? They talked about numbers. In 1860, the property of this country, equally divided, would have given every man, woman and child $514 each. That was their argument. The total wealth of America divided by the total population. A simple calculation that proved, mathematically, that everyone should be fine. In 1870, the share would have been $624. See? Getting better. More wealth. More to go around. The system was working. In 1880, $814. And in 1886, when Campbell was doing her work, the estimate was $900 or more per person. $900. A fortune to the women in the tenements. Enough to live on for years, if you were careful. What madness to talk of suffering, the economists said, when this flood of wealth pours through the land. What madness. That was the word they used. Anyone who claimed people were struggling was mad, crazy, disconnected from the obvious reality of all this wealth sloshing around. And if you pressed them, if you pointed to specific cases, specific people, specific suffering that couldn't be denied, they had an answer for that too. Admitting that the lowest class suffer, they said, it is chiefly crime, drunkenness, etc., that brings suffering. It was their fault. The poor were poor because they drank, because they committed crimes, because they made bad choices, not because the system was broken, not because the wealth that was supposedly $900 per person somehow never reached the people who needed it most. The majority are perfectly comfortable. Campbell heard this claim over and over, read it in letters from respectable men, heard it in interviews with people who shaped opinion. The majority are perfectly comfortable. Only a few suffer, and those few deserve it. so she set out to prove them wrong. She went to the tenements herself, knocked on doors, climbed those dark stairs, sat in those 10-foot rooms and listened to women explain exactly how they lived on 12 cents a day. "Let us see how comfortable," she wrote. "Let us see." And what she found was damning. The average cost of food per head across all the cases she documented on the West Side was 90 cents per week. For many, the diet was the same: baker's bread, tea, sugar, a little milk and butter, and a bit of meat once or twice a week. That was it. That was the comfortable life the economists were defending. 90 cents a week, less than 13 cents a day, for food. Meanwhile, the political economists calculated $900 per person per year as the equal share of national wealth. That worked out to about $2.40 a day, 20 times what these women were spending on food. 20 times. The wealth existed. The economists weren't lying about that. America in 1886 was rich and getting richer. Factories churning out goods, railroads connecting coasts, fortunes being made in steel and oil and banking. The Gilded Age, they'd call it later. Gold on the surface. But the gold wasn't equally divided. It wasn't even close to equally divided. The per capita calculation was a fiction, a mathematical trick that hid the real distribution behind an average that meant nothing to anyone actually living on that average. The widow and Emmy weren't getting their $900. The German woman on the 4th floor wasn't getting hers. The sick girl sewing baby cloaks for 66 cents wasn't getting hers. The money was going somewhere, just not to them. And the economists knew this. They had to know. But they kept citing the same numbers anyway, kept insisting that wealth, equally divided, would give everyone enough. As if equal division was happening. As if anyone seriously proposed that it should. The portion of the public whose thinking is done for them, Campbell wrote, that's who believed this nonsense. People who didn't want to look too hard, who found comfort in statistics that suggested everything was fine, who would not be convinced, she said, even though one rose from the dead. She was quoting scripture there, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Even if someone came back from the dead to warn them, some people wouldn't listen. Some people didn't want to know. But Campbell kept documenting anyway, kept asking her questions, kept writing down the numbers in her own notebooks. Different numbers, real numbers. The 12 cents a day, the 90 cents a week, the 14-hour shifts for 85 cents. Here's what she found, beyond the individual stories. Everything cost more when you were poor. Coal by the scuttle ran 12 cents, which was more than double the cost per tonne if you could afford to buy in bulk. Wood by the bundle, oil by the quart. Every small purchase carried a poverty penalty, a surcharge for not having enough money to buy efficiently. The women in the tenements knew this. They complained about it. They tried to save up enough to buy a quarter tonne of coal at once, because the math was so much better. But they never could. Something always came up. An illness, a rent increase, a dull season when the work dried up, and they were back to buying by the scuttle, paying twice what they should have. Because that's what being poor meant. The sellers made their profit on desperation. The utmost margin of profit, Campbell noted, the smaller the purchase, the larger the markup. The poorer you were, the more you paid. And the food itself. Campbell noticed something that only one of her subjects had figured out. The same amount of money could buy better nutrition if you knew how. The Swiss woman with her 7-cent soup understood. Bones and vegetables and barley, stretched over 2 days. More nourishment for less money than bread and tea. She tried to teach her neighbours. They ate her soup and said it was good. But they couldn't do it themselves. They didn't have the time. Beans, said one indignant soul when Campbell suggested alternatives. What time have I to think of beans? Or what money to buy coal to cook them? That was the trap. The vicious circle. Working 14 hours a day left no time to cook properly. No time to soak beans overnight and simmer them for hours. No time to make the meals that would have been healthier and cheaper. So they ate bread, drank tea, spent more per calorie than they needed to because they were buying convenience, buying speed, buying the only thing that fit into a life consumed by work, and the tea itself. That was the final piece of Campbell's puzzle. Tea and the sewing machine are naturally inseparable allies, she wrote. Not partners, allies, like they were fighting on the same side. And in a way, they were. Both of them working against the women who depended on them. The rank fluid retarding digestion. That's what tea did. It slowed down your stomach, made food sit longer, made you feel less hungry, even when your body needed more. The half-fed peasant demands a bone in his potato, Campbell wrote, because the bone makes the potato last longer, gives the illusion of fullness. Tea did the same thing. Tea like lie to put a backbone in you, as the sewing woman had said. Tea that kept you going when you should have stopped. Tea that suppressed the appetite so you didn't feel how little you were eating. And so long as the sewing women must work 14 hours daily, they will remain so. That was the system. The machine demanded long hours. The long hours left no time to cook. The lack of cooking pushed them toward tea and bread. The tea suppressed their appetite. The suppressed appetite let them work longer on less food. And around it went. A wheel that ground them down while appearing to keep them moving. The economists didn't see this. Or they saw it and didn't care. Their numbers said the wealth was there. Their calculations proved that everyone should be fine. If people were suffering, well, it must be their own fault. Crime and drunkenness and poor choices, not the system. Never the system. Campbell published her findings in the New York Tribune. Readers saw, for the first time, what comfortable actually looked like. The notebooks with their careful accounting, the shoes patched with dead men's coats, the 12 cents a day that supposedly proved everything was fine. She published names, or at least enough details to make the women real. Not statistics, not abstractions. People. The widow from Greenwich Village who'd fallen so far. The German woman on the 4th floor with her spotless room. The Swiss woman making soup because she'd been taught to cook as a child, before everything went wrong. This was Campbell's method, and it was radical for its time. Instead of arguing about numbers with the economists, she simply showed the lives behind the numbers. Let readers see for themselves what per capita wealth looked like when it wasn't per capita at all, when it was concentrated at the top while the bottom scraped by on tea and bread. The responses were predictable. Some readers were moved, some were outraged. Some insisted the women must be exaggerating, must be hiding income, must be drinking away what they earned. The same defences that always came out when poverty was documented. The same refusal to believe that the system could produce such results. But the stories were too specific to dismiss entirely. Too detailed, the notebooks with their careful columns. The German woman's broken English explaining her careful calculations. The exact price of cheese and liverwurst and coal by the scuttle. You couldn't make this up. Couldn't invent these details. The authenticity came through in every line. Did it change anything? Some things. Slowly. The documentation of conditions like these contributed to the reform movements that would eventually bring labour laws, housing regulations, public health improvements. Not overnight. Not quickly enough for the widow and Emmy and the German woman and all the others whose stories Campbell preserved. What happened to them, specifically? We don't know. Campbell moved on to other investigations. The Tribune published other stories. The women in the tenements kept living their lives, or stopped living them, and either way, their names disappeared from the record. Emmy might have married, might have found that chance her mother kept hoping for, or she might have stayed at the machine until it wore her out, until her eyes failed and her hands cramped, and she became one more body in Potter's Field. The German woman was 65 when Campbell met her. She had a few more years, maybe. A few more winters of choosing between food and heat. And then She was gone, and her spotless room filled up with someone else's furniture, someone else's struggles. The sick girl sewing baby cloaks was already dying. Campbell knew it. Everyone knew it. The only question was whether she'd last long enough to see her children grown, to see them earning, to know that they'd survive without her. These aren't happy endings, because there weren't happy endings. Not for most of them. The system that trapped them didn't suddenly become kind. The wealth that bypassed them didn't suddenly arrive. They lived and struggled and died, and the tenements filled up with new families who did the same. But the stories survived. The numbers survived. The evidence that the majority were not perfectly comfortable, that the wealth was not equally divided, that the system created the poverty it blamed on the poor. That evidence mattered. It still matters, because the arguments haven't changed as much as you'd think. The per capita calculations, the claims that the economy is strong, that growth is happening, that the numbers say everything is fine, the suggestion that if people are struggling, it must be their own fault. Different numbers now, different amounts, but the same basic trick. Take the total wealth, divide by the total population, declare the problem solved. You've heard these arguments, you'll hear them again, and when you do, you can remember the widow in her first floor room, her notebook, her 12 cents a day, her daughter who liked clams and never made mistakes. The majority are perfectly comfortable. Let us see how comfortable. Campbell's work joined a tradition. Before her, there was Dickens describing London's poor. After her, there'd be Jacob Riis with his camera in the tenements, Upton Sinclair in the meatpacking plants, Studs Terkel with his tape recorder in the Depression. People who refused to let the comfortable ignore the uncomfortable, who documented what the statistics hid, who put faces and names and specific details on the abstractions that made suffering easy to dismiss. It's a necessary work, an endless work, because every generation produces new economists with new calculations proving everything is fine. And every generation needs someone willing to climb the stairs and knock on the doors and ask the simple question, how do you live? The answer is always harder than the numbers suggest, always more complicated, always involves choices that no one should have to make. Like whether to pay your dead husband's debt or save for the next emergency. Like whether to buy coal or buy food. Like whether to teach your neighbours to cook better or accept that they don't have the time. These choices are still being made, right now, in your city, in every city. The tenements have different names now. The sewing machines have been replaced by other machines, other forms of grinding labour. But the calculation remains. How do you stretch what you have? How do you survive on what you're given? Campbell wanted people to ask that question, wanted them to really ask it. Not as an abstraction, but as a reality. What would you eat on 12 cents a day? How would you keep warm? What would you sacrifice? Your bed holds you gently now. The night has grown deep. The numbers in Campbell's notebooks have long since faded, the ink giving way to time. But the truth they contained, the careful accounting of impossible survival, that persists. Somewhere in this city, in cities everywhere, people are still doing the math, still figuring out how to stretch what they have, still choosing between food and heat, between medicine and rent, between today and tomorrow. The amounts have changed, the calculations remain. But you're warm tonight. That's something. That's the thing that matters right now. The women in the tenements would have understood warmth, would have appreciated it with a depth that's hard to imagine from your safe place. For them, warmth wasn't guaranteed. Warmth cost 12 cents a scuttle. Warmth was a luxury that competed with everything else. You have it without thinking. Take it without counting. Sleep in it without wondering if you can afford it. That's the distance between their world and yours. The gap that Campbell tried to bridge with her careful questions and her careful notebooks. She wanted people to understand, wanted the comfortable to see the uncomfortable. And now, you've seen. Now you know about Emmy and her clams. The dress that looked very well. The German woman buying groceries for strangers. The sick girl sewing bright cloaks for babies she'd never meet. You know about the 90 cents a week and the 12 cents a day. The poverty penalty that made everything cost more. The tea that kept them going when they should have stopped. You know about the political economists and their calculations. The $900 per person that existed only as an average, a fiction, a number that meant nothing to anyone living in its shadow. You know. And knowing is the first step. Not the last step, not the solution, but the beginning of something. Campbell knew that. It's why she kept knocking on doors. There was a carpenter. Campbell mentioned him at the very beginning of her investigation, before she climbed the tenement stairs, before she met the widow or the German woman or any of the others. A tall worker, hurrying along with his box of tools, talking as he went with a companion half his size. The companion was German, interjecting strange oaths as he listened to whatever story was being poured out to him. The nearer the river, the nearer to hell. That's what the carpenter said. His big chest holding more of the same sort of words, Campbell noted. Strong words, angry words, probably. The kind of words that came from a man who knew what he was talking about, because he'd lived it. But Campbell never told his story. With that story, she wrote, we have at present nothing to do. She let the carpenter walk past with his tools and his German companion and his strong words, and she turned instead to the women in the tenements. His story disappeared. Whatever he was telling his friend, whatever had put that anger in his chest, we'll never know. He walked out of the record and into the anonymous mass of workers who built the city, without leaving their names behind. How many stories like his were there? How many men and women passed Campbell on those West Side streets, each carrying a story she'd never hear? Thousands, tens of thousands, a whole city of people surviving on wages that didn't survive, keeping their own mental notebooks, making their own impossible calculations. The widow with her careful columns was rare, not because her situation was rare, because she wrote it down, because she was willing to show a stranger, because Campbell happened to knock on her door instead of the door next to it. One building over, one floor up, there were other widows, other daughters working 14-hour days, other German women choosing between food and heat. Their stories were just as real, just as detailed, just as full of clams and cabbage water and small kindnesses. But nobody asked them. Nobody knocked. That's the weight of history. Not just the stories we know, but the stories we don't. The millions of lives that passed without being recorded. The voices that spoke into silence and were absorbed by it. The carpenter's companion was interjecting strange German oaths, little bursts of sympathy or outrage probably, responding to whatever his friend was telling him. Two workers sharing their troubles while they walked. The most ordinary thing in the world. And somewhere in that conversation was a life, a struggle, a story that mattered to someone. Gone now. All of it. Gone. For the West Side, Campbell wrote at the end of her investigation, the story was quite plain. But for such returns as the East has to offer, there is still room for further detail. She was planning to continue. The West Side was just the beginning. The East Side waited, with its own tenements, its own workers, its own impossible math. Kleindeutschland with its German families, the Jewish quarters where tailors made knee pants for 45 cents a dozen, the Italian neighbourhoods around Mulberry Bend, each block its own world, each world full of stories. Did she go? Did she climb those other stairs, knock on those other doors? The record doesn't say. Maybe she did. Maybe those stories exist somewhere, in old newspapers and archives, waiting for someone to find them. Or maybe she moved on to other work, other investigations, and the East Side kept its secrets. Either way, there's always more. That's what she was saying. The story was quite plain, but there's always more. Always another building, another family, another notebook that nobody's asking to see. The city never stopped producing these lives. Even as Campbell was writing, new immigrants were arriving at Castle Garden, blinking in the unfamiliar light, carrying everything they owned. They'd find their way to the tenements eventually, find work that paid too little, learn the price of coal by the scuttle, discover that America's streets weren't paved with gold after all, just with the same old cobblestones that hurt your feet when your shoes wore through. And they'd survive. Somehow. The way people always survive. With tea that put a backbone in them. With neighbours who fell on the ice and needed looking after. With children who brought baskets of wood scraps and learned without being taught that kindness was survival too. The specific names changed. The addresses changed. The particular combinations of struggle and hope. But the underlying reality persisted. The wealth that flowed past without stopping. The poverty that stayed. It's quiet now, where you are. The tenements are silent in your imagination. The sewing machines have stopped. The women have found what rest they can, in their crowded rooms, in their narrow beds, in whatever peace the night allows. And you're here, still listening, still holding these stories in your mind. Think about what you've heard tonight. Not the statistics, though those matter. Not the arguments against the economists, though those matter too. Think about the people. A woman who patched her shoes with her dead husband's coat because she hadn't had new ones in 2 years. Who kept a notebook anyway. Who found a way to make soup from water that other people threw away. A daughter who never made mistakes at the machine. Who rode the streetcar downtown, watching the city pass, carrying her patchwork secrets beneath a dress that looked very well. An old German woman in a spotless room, buying groceries for a dying neighbour's family because that's what you did. Because there was no one else. Because the alternative was watching children go hungry. A Swiss woman who made real soup, nourishing soup, for 7 cents. Who tried to teach her neighbours and failed, not because they didn't want to learn, but because they didn't have the hours in the day. A sick girl sewing bright cloaks for babies she would never see, knowing she was running out of time, hoping her children would survive her. These aren't characters in a story. They were real. They breathed the same air we breathe, walked streets we could still find if we looked hard enough, felt cold and hunger and exhaustion, and love, and hope. They're gone now, all of them. The widow and Emmy and the German woman and the Swiss woman and the sick girl, and the carpenter and his German companion, and everyone else who crossed Campbell's path, and everyone who didn't. Gone the way everyone goes eventually, into whatever comes after, into memory, if they're lucky, into forgetting, if they're not. But something of them remains. Not their bodies, which returned to earth long ago. Not their voices, which fell silent before your grandparents were born. But the shape of their lives, the pattern of their struggles, the specific weight of their particular survival. That's what stories preserve. Not the people themselves, but something about them. A trace, an echo, a way of understanding what it meant to be human in a particular place and time. They'll fade, probably. By tomorrow you might not remember the specific numbers, the 12 cents a day, the 90 cents a week, the $5.51 left over after rent and food and everything else. Numbers blur together, details slip away. But something else might stay, the feeling of it, the weight of lives pressed down by forces they couldn't control, the stubborn persistence of people who kept going anyway, the small moments of grace between the grinding. That's what stories do. They don't just inform, They mark you, leave traces that show up later in unexpected ways, in how you see a price tag, in how you think about work, in how you understand the gap between what things cost and what people have. The widow would have liked that. The idea that her careful accounting, her notebook full of numbers, might somehow reach across the years and change how someone thinks. She kept those records for herself, to see how the money went. But they became something else. Evidence. Testimony. A voice from a first-floor room that still speaks. "We do want to see a paper sometimes," she'd said. Even in poverty, she wanted to know what was happening in the world beyond her walls. She was curious. She was alive to things outside her immediate struggle. She read about cabbage water soup, and remembered it, and used it. Maybe that's the most human thing about her. Not the suffering, which was universal, not the survival, which was shared, but the curiosity, the wanting to know, the refusal to shrink down to nothing but need. You have that same curiosity. It's why you're here, why you've spent this time in rooms you'll never visit, with people you'll never meet, learning the texture of lives that ended long before yours began. Curiosity is its own kind of kindness, a way of saying, your story matters. I want to hear it. Tell me how you live. Campbell asked that question 100 times, maybe more. How do you live? And the answers filled notebooks of their own. Her notebooks, the widow's notebooks. Records that survived because someone thought they were worth keeping. Most things aren't kept. Most lives leave no record at all. The carpenter with his strong words is gone. His German companion is gone. The story being poured out between them, the one Campbell had nothing to do with, is gone forever. And there were so many others. The children playing in the halls who grew up into workers and parents and grandparents whose names we'll never know. The boy who brought the basket of wood scraps. What became of him? Did he survive childhood? Did he find work? Did he tell his own children about the tenements where he learned to notice things, to gather scraps, to help? The priest who heard confessions on Sunday mornings, the shopkeeper at Eric's who sold remnants to women who couldn't afford full bolts of cloth, the landlord who raised the rent $1 twice in 11 years, his name lost even as his small cruelties persisted. All gone. Every one of them. A whole city of the dead, stretching back through time, their lives as real as yours, their struggles as pressing, their hopes as fierce. We stand on their shoulders without knowing it, walk streets they paved, live in buildings that rose where their buildings fell, eat food that descends, somehow, from the traditions they carried across oceans and adapted to new circumstances. They made us possible. The ones who survived and passed on what they learned. The ones who didn't survive, but whose work contributed anyway. The whole, vast, web of effort and suffering and small triumph that brought us here, to this night, to this quiet moment where someone is telling stories and someone else is listening. But the question remains, how do you live? How do we live, any of us, in a world that asks so much and gives so little? How do we find the small joys, the moments of connection, the reasons to keep going? The women in the tenements had answers, imperfect answers, answers shaped by circumstance and necessity, but answers, community, even when it cost something you couldn't afford. Hope, even when the evidence was against it. Love, for daughters who deserved better, for neighbours who fell on the ice, for the small daily acts that made impossible lives slightly more possible. These aren't grand solutions. They didn't fix anything. The system that ground them down kept grinding. The wealth kept flowing past. The political economists kept calculating their per capita averages and declaring everything fine. But the women kept living anyway, kept sewing and surviving and looking after each other, kept hoping for changes that mostly didn't come, kept being human in conditions that tried to reduce them to something less. That's worth knowing, worth remembering, worth carrying with you into whatever tomorrow brings. Your breath has probably slowed by now, the rhythm of these words settling into something quieter. The night holding you the way the widow's notebook held her numbers. Carefully, completely, with attention to every small thing. Sleep isn't far. You can feel it at the edges, the gentle pull toward rest that the body knows even when the mind resists. The women in the tenements knew that pull too. After 14 hours at the machine, after the calculations and the worry and the endless figuring, sleep came eventually, even for them. Even in rooms that smelled of the broken sink in the hall, even on beds that offered little comfort. Sleep was free. One of the few things that was. You didn't have to pay for it by the scuttle, didn't have to choose between sleep and something else. It came for everyone equally, rich and poor, comfortable and struggling. In sleep, the widow wasn't a widow anymore. Emmy wasn't worn down by the machine. The German woman wasn't choosing between food and heat. They were just people, dreaming whatever dreams came to them, resting bodies that would have to rise again too soon. And you're here, in your own bed, in your own time, with your own tomorrow waiting. The distance between their world and yours is measured in years, in reforms that came too late for them but in time for others, in small changes that added up to larger changes, in the slow, imperfect work of making things slightly better. It's not finished. That work never is. But it continues. Because people like Campbell kept asking their questions. Because people like you keep listening. The first words lingered, Campbell wrote about the carpenter. And they linger still. They do. Across all these years, across all this distance, the words linger. The nearer the river, the nearer to hell. Lord, help us all. We must get along somehow. These phrases hang in the air of rooms that no longer exist, spoken by people who are long gone, preserved only because someone thought they mattered enough to write down. They mattered. They still matter. And now they're yours. Part of you, woven into whatever understanding you carry forward from this night. The tenements are quiet. The stories have been told. The numbers have been counted, one more time, in the long ledger of who we were and how we lived. Rest now. Let the weight of it settle. Let the women find their peace, and find your own. Tomorrow the world will still be here, still full of struggles and small kindnesses, still asking how we live, how we survive, how we stay human when the math doesn't work. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, you're warm. Tonight, you're safe. Tonight, someone told you a story and you listened all the way through. That's enough. That's everything, really. The night is deep. The words have done their work. Let them go now. Let it all go. The calculations and the courage, the suffering and the survival, the voices from the past, growing softer, growing distant, fading into the quiet that was always waiting underneath. Sleep well.